I mean, again,
and so the actual sort of the omen that is sort of the core of this is that you see the slots when a monarch is about to die.
You either see the slots. But what's interesting is that the deer actually is there when the monarch. The deer actually does appear as this presaging of the death of the monarch. If you actually see the deer itself, then you will end up dying a violent death. But hopefully you don't. And if you but you can judge just from the slots whether the deer has been there, and so you can then read the slots to discover whether the deer will actually die.
The violent deaths of the keepers should coincide with the deaths of monarchs.
Very good.
If we're accepting without question.
Within a year or two, I would say yes.
Welcome to Finding Folklore, the videos, the deep dives.
The first of many. This is we're trying this out. Who knows how this is going to go? I hope you enjoy it. This is essentially going to be a meandering and mellifluous, vague and waffly, but hopefully densely detail-rich and fascinating conversation between two of the great minds of the 21st century. James Carney.
And Brice Stratford.
Thank you. Didn't even rehearse that. That's just...
And for this first video, we're going to be talking about The Red King and the White Ship, episode 1 of the podcast.
This is obviously, if you haven't listened to the podcast yet, do Finding Folklore on all your good Podmonger apps or whatever the kids call them.
If you can't find it, then let us know and we'll try and fix that. But yes, we're talking about...
These videos are a companion, essentially. Each of these videos is a long-form, for those who are that way inclined, a long-form discussion video companion piece to the podcast episode itself. We'll be hopefully getting them out. They should be coming out about a week after each episode. The episodes are all released on the 1st and the 13th of the month, for the most part. And then I think the 7th and the 21st are the days that the videos are released to accompany them.
So our thinking behind this is that essentially there's a lot to say about every single one of the stories and every single one of the songs in the season of Finding Folklore podcast, and we don't want to be kind of going into minute depth in the podcast itself, but we think that the people are interested in this sort of thing.
Some people.
So there's a
some people.
Yeah, there's a good market.
There are some people who will be as interested as we are in these things.
We are interested in
and
this
the
stuff.
vast majority will not be, and so they can enjoy the fun and games, the introductory nature of the podcast proper.
Yeah.
And then this is the dense deep dive for the hardcore fans, all those countless hardcore fans. So essentially, on that note, if you've just come here from hearing the podcast, and if you haven't, go hear the podcast. We finished the podcast with this mention of foodstuffs.
Yeah. Which will be in every episode.
Yeah, every episode. So as you should be aware, the basic structure and format of Finding Folklore is we open with an oral storytelling performance, a performance storytelling example of a folk tale that's based around a folk tradition. We then have a specially commissioned recording of a folk song that's somehow related to that tradition. We then have a 30, 45 minute chat about the history and cultural heritage around and behind that tradition. We then throw in as a fun little button right at the end, we throw in a discussion of a piece of heritage food, a traditional English recipe that is related to that tradition, and then go out on a poetry reading, not an original piece of poetry, a good period piece of poetry. And then having enjoyed it very much, you eagerly run over to watch this video.
Yeah, after rating, reviewing, telling your friends,
commenting how well
liking,
it is,
subscribing,
all the stuff. So on that
please
note,
do all of that.
We finished the last podcast with venison Rufus, or New Forest venison, which is essentially this. It's essentially a meatloaf, which is fun because of it being lammas, which is. I think actually it's 4 parts minced venison, 1 part minced smoked bacon.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least it should be. I then, the day after the podcast aired, I had a dinner party at which I made this venison Rufus. It was I used too much bacon.
Too much bacon.
Too much bacon. That's me. Too much bacon. I didn't need to, but I did.
It was delicious. I can see that maybe it was on the bacon side.
On the bacon side, yeah.
A little bit salty.
Everything aside from the too much bacon was as per the ingredients, which was interesting. I wouldn't usually cook with lemon rind and parsley. Odd combination.
And you boiled it for...
Yeah, boiled it for like 3 hours.
Great.
It was larger than the recipe said 2 to 2.5, but it was larger than the recipe, so I boiled it for 3. And that seemed the correct amount of time to boil for. Very interesting. Very nice, actually. Surprisingly nice.
Because you said you wouldn't usually just boil something like that.
Unless it was haggis. That's the only time when I made haggis, it was the only time from scratch. The only time I have boiled something for such an extended period of time. I also did cookie dumpling.
That famously came out very, very well.
The haggis was, that was some years ago now. Yeah. I did haggis from scratch with a lamb's pluck. Mm-hmm. Very, very good. Once you've made it yourself, you'll never want to buy it again.
The venison Rufus, I think, because you've had a few dinner parties before, and we often eat too much, drink too much, stay up too late.
I think at every single one of we have done that.
But it seems, I felt like we didn't overeat with the venison Rufus, and partly it was because it was so dense.
Yeah. So dense.
It was a really hefty thing.
It was lovely. It was surprising. It doesn't look like much, obviously. It looks...
Yeah, it didn't look pretty like from the outside.
But I don't... the one thing it does say you should... I think there was supposed to be a garnish, which I didn't have anything for. What was the garnish supposed to be? Parsley... I think it was supposed to be garnished with parsley.
You put some parsley in it.
Yeah. There was supposed to be parsley
there
and
was
then a garnish.
Lemon rind, was it? Lemon zest.
In terms of the ingredients, it tasted incredibly highly seasoned. But it was literally, the ingredients were literally just the venison, the bacon, all minced up to get the same consistency and mixed. Breadcrumbs and egg to bind it. Egg from my own chickens in the garden. It was all very jolly. And then it was just onion. No garlic, which was odd. Just onion, lemon rind, and parsley. That was it. That was it. That was all the seasoning. But it tasted incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And dense and heavy. And it was loved by all. And actually, what I did the following day was I took slices of it and fried them. And they were gorgeous.
Ooh, lovely.
Really nice, yeah. It got this lovely crust on the outside and the nice, soft... pate consistency in the middle. It worked very well.
Now, the other thing that we had in the same dinner party was the soup.
Dillegrout.
Soup.
Dillegrout. Which was really good, actually.
I think possibly even more exceptional than the venison Rufus.
Yeah, Dillegrout.
The Dillegrout was a revelation.
So Dillegrout, for those that don't know, was a weird... So it's been going since the 11th century... And I think from the 11th century to the 1820s, 1820, 1821, from the crowning of William the Conqueror's wife, Matilda, all the way up then into the 19th century, I think with one of the Georges, it was served at the coronation of every member of the royal family, every monarch and their spouse, I think. So it's a genuine 11th century taste. I don't know why they would stop. It's been going for almost 800 years by that point. Why on earth would they stop?
Yeah, the 1820s seems like a strange time for something to...
This is really weird.
It's not like a Reformation thing.
Why not bring it back? It's lovely. It's weird. It's basically like a sweet almond milk and chicken soup.
And I think multiple people around the table were saying it tastes medieval.
Yeah, which is fun. Which is something we discussed.
Yeah.
What does that mean? How do you
know what medieval tastes like?
Actually, it tasted a bit like Christmas. It had a lot of mulled wine spices in it. So essentially, it was you make your own almond milk. Almond milk? I don't know. What's the proper way of saying?
I would say almond.
Almond or almond? I don't know what I would say.
I'd say almond.
I have no... I'd say lemon. Almond milk with... chicken, spice. Sweet white wine was in it. It was spiced with mace, lot of mace is involved in
sort of early cooking, isn't it?
Cooking. Yeah. What was it? Mace, cloves, ginger root was involved. There was vinegar. There was rose water. Was there anything else? Salt and pepper, obviously. Beef stock I used. I used a little beef stock. Oh, yes, there should have been beef stock. There was also beef stock in the venison Rufus.
But there was some stuff with like mashing up a bit of chicken in with the almond milk.
Yeah, so you divide the dark meat and the white meat, and you add them differently. I mean, we won't go into
no. But
it's interesting because
regardless, very nice.
It would have been, and the reason it's interesting, particularly, is that it would have been served at the coronation of William Rufus.
Yes.
So this was a taste that William Rufus definitely ate. I don't know whether he enjoyed it, but he ate it.
Someone we were speaking to, someone else who was at the dinner, said that it tasted like food that comes from a country that doesn't exist.
Yeah, which it does. Yeah. The past, etc. Is another country. Blah 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 blah.
Absolutely,
as they say.
Blah blah blah, as they say.
Yeah, it was really, as you say, interesting to see how many people who do not necessarily have any interest in history, either from an academic or a folk sense, to see how it tasted like the medieval times to them. It tasted of that time and period. And I don't know whether that's some kind of mental synesthesia whereby certain imagery we associate with certain tastes because we perceive that, or whether it's just because it tastes like Christmas because of those things. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
it's interesting. There must have some associations. It's very difficult to say why you would think.
I'm reticent to just dismiss it out of hand as being just a silly thing, a silly nonsense that people just project that onto it.
So even Christmas doesn't seem to quite account for.
It also didn't really taste that Christmassy. Actually, even though it had those flavors, it didn't taste Christmassy to me at all. At all, actually.
Well, I think it's going to remain a mystery why mace and ginger tastes of the medieval.
It's very sweet as well. I think there was also sugar in it. It tasted actually like a kind of the Indian restaurant up the road, Passage to India. It's called. Often gives a free sort of rice pudding with currants and other things, and it tasted a lot like that, but chickeny. Weird combination of flavors. So, so that covers that.
That's the food.
In summary, we recommend both dillegrout and venison Rufus, or New Forest venison. New Forest venison is the proper term for it, and I think that actually that relates it to Hampshire goose. Hampshire goose is a similar kind of dish that's supposed to be. It's like an alternative to actual goose. So I think it's related to that. Like mock turtle or something. But obviously these days it's very confusing because if you search for New Forest venison, you just find venison from the New Forest. Yeah, so that's standard. So
this was invented in the days before Google searching.
Before Google search. Those the bad old days.
So
hang on, why don't we check?
Let's have a quick break.
Have a very quick pause. I think a break's overstating it.
We'll disappear for 5 seconds.
Due to our hardware setup and the experimental nature of this, we will have these short breaks every now and again just to make sure everything is still running. So bear with us. One moment. Lovely, welcome back. I hope that was painless. I hope you run off and bought the item that was advertised to you just then. I think it was it my book?
Could have been.
Who knows?
We don't know yet.
It was either a book or the podcast. Either way, I hope you engage with it.
So, I guess we should talk about the main subject, which is the story of William Rufus.
The story of William Rufus and how we engaged with that.
Yeah, I guess the engagement with it is kind of more what we want to be discussing, because you learn the story of William Rufus by hearing the story
of William Rufus, famously.
Did we go much into the history of the story in the actual kind of...
What the fact
of it being... a chronicle history, this story.
Yeah, we did talk about
mentioned
that
a little bit.
Yeah, we did talk about that. the historic element is quite an interesting one in terms of the line between fact and fiction. I think that the earliest account of it is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, because obviously that was maintained. Some versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, of which there were various versions in different church essablishments, were maintained well past the point of the Norman conquest, and it includes. It's referenced. It mentions that this happens in very simple terms. I think it just says something like William Rufus was killed in a hunting accident by an arrow shot from one of his own men, or something. Nothing more than that. Interestingly, there's about, I think, somewhere like 3 to 5 accounts then over the next 30, 40 years. And after that, pretty much all other accounts are just rehashes of those essential pieces of information. We get, and different accounts give different details and elements, but really after that point, after the 1130s, maybe 1140s, but after that point, really the idea of there being any new information coming in is unlikely.
Any stuff that actually was from the event,
is unlikely. The approach that we took was not to, we didn't build it. Oh, if anyone is interested, by the way, I would recommend the Frank Barlow biography of William Rufus. William Rufus by Frank Barlow. It's from the 80s. I think it's the best. It's not the only biography, but I think it's the best one. Oh, it might be from the 70s, actually. I will tell you when it's from. It is from the year 1983. Frank Barlow, William Rufus, the English Monarchs series. There have been others since, but I don't think they added anything to it. And they managed to, I don't think they're very useful. This does a really good job of not being sensationalist, but still being interesting and quite rich and dense in its...
So that's kind of about his whole life rather than just the story of his death.
And obviously it finishes with his death, but... That isn't the approach that we took in developing this. This isn't something that we read up on the academic history of in order to develop. This is very much from the folk
finding
tradition.
Finding
folktales, This is from the folk tradition, and obviously there are elements you can see in the folk tradition which certain elements come from various sources at one point and then develop. A really obvious one. So an interesting one, actually, which I would like to talk to now, because we focused on it in the podcast, is Cob. Cob the Arrowsmith. Now, interestingly, that comes, the earliest germ of that is from, I think it's the account by Orderic Vitalis from about 1135. So writing about 35, I think, ish. Sorry if I'm not right on the dates.
Yeah.
We will probably put sources at the bottom.
This comes...
Well, let me tell you.
Tell me.
It isn't. It says that a blacksmith gave 6 arrows to Rufus, and Rufus gave 2 to Tyrrell.
Right.
It says that, right? And it's now. What's interesting about that is that then remains fairly. That detail doesn't become much popularized in much of the later versions of it. It's mentioned here and there. But certainly that particular detail doesn't become very well established in the literary or historical versions of it. It's generally dismissed as being as being part of Orderic Vitalis's manipulation of the story to be more pro-Rufus. But what's interesting about that is that in the New Forest, that consistently remains this key element, and not only that, but there's greater detail. It's not a blacksmith; he's an arrowsmith.
Becomes magical, becomes a master craftsman,
magical man. Name of Cob, and we
given a name,
given a name, and given a place where he lives, Coblands. Now, I mentioned in the podcast, I think that this greater emphasis on it may have something to do with the narrative idea of reminding people of the arrows and their weight and importance.
Yeah.
But here's an even wilder notion. That, as I said, that the blacksmith detail comes from, I think, 1135, the mid 1130s. about 35 years after it happened. Quite a lot of new information is added in that. Jeffrey Guymar, writing a little bit later, a smidge later, I think, but for an aristocratic patroness rather than for the church, as all the other accounts were, because of course the church was hostile to Rufus. Rufus was not a friend of the church.
Yep.
So this aristocratic version from Guymar is far more sympathetic. Guymar adds in the detail that these arrows were barbed, which again makes them special somehow.
Yeah.
So that they're somehow beyond the common stock. These new details coming in 35 years after all the original documentary sources, alongside a number of other very specific details from Guymar's version, such as the specific types of tree that Rufus or Tyrrell was standing against or near when it happened, and the specific layout of it, implies that this was oral information, probably from I won't say probably, potentially, plausibly from a forester or a huntsman who was there, but whatever, very plausibly, these details come from an oral tradition which was still going 35 odd years after the death of Rufus.
That's within living memory.
Which is very much within the a huntsman, say 25 years old, would be 60.
An old man by their standards.
Potentially, but totally alive, and there's no reason he would be dead. We won't get into the whole thing of life expectancy and the average age of death, but suffice it to say that plenty of people live to be 60, 70, or even older in the 11th century. Loads of people did. It was the high infant mortality rates that drags the average down.
And they may well start to want to tell the stories of the glory of their youth and the exciting events.
Very plausibly.
That they witnessed. Yeah.
And so I think it is also, on the one hand, it's plausible that this detail was made up by the authors, because by Guymar and by Orderic Vitalis, in order to, I don't know, skew things to make it more poetic, to add narrative balance. But then I'm always reticent of just explaining away a source by saying, "Oh, they made it up." I think that's it's very common that people do that, and I think that's I don't really like doing that, because that's okay, maybe, but then maybe you made everything up. Maybe you made nothing up. Like, then at that point you're lost.
Yeah, you're just guessing.
You're just guessing. But before I lose the train of thought, specifically, the alternative is that the New Forest tradition did not then hold on to that version, but it was already in the New Forest tradition.
Oh, so that had been maybe going along.
So that it was already in the oral folklore, and it's from the oral folklore within the New Forest.
Magic arrows, which were already being talked about, that someone says, "Oh, they were barbed arrows."
Yeah. That it gets taken from that folklore, which then survives all the way to now, rather than that the folklore picked up randomly, held onto that fairly obscure detail from one of the various historic accounts.
Yeah.
Especially as that one detail probably, I believe, came from living memory anyway, from someone on the ground, rather than from the other textual accounts. Yeah, and either way, it's been taken on and absorbed into the folk tradition, but it might be that it was always of that folk tradition, and was retained within that folk tradition.
That's very interesting. Sorry, go on.
Interesting, and you have the same thing with Purkis. I think in those old accounts it refers to either peasants or some of the servants and so on, then drag the corpse of Rufus in the wagon, in the wain or the cart off to Winchester Cathedral. And it's in the New Forest that then this name is added. Now, I believe that research has been done which has found that even though Purkis is a very common name in the forest now, and has been for the last 500 years, they can't find any record of Purkis's back in the 11th century. But, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any. There's lots of people who don't appear in records in the 11th century.
To some extent, I don't feel like the actual,
the history of it is irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant.
The significant thing is that it's in the story. Yeah. And also, I was on our little stall at the New Forest show. We launched the podcast on the 1st of August at the New Forest show. And we
Very
were...
good time it was, actually.
It was very hot.
It was very hot. It was very hot. 3 full long days in that extraordinary heat. Waking up much earlier than I'm used to waking up. But great fun and really good crowds.
And I was there working on carving a mask, as you do, at the Heritage Centre.
Carving a mask of this fellow or something along these lines, the New Forest Ooser.
We could come back to him later because he's not unrelated to this story.
That's
to
true.
Some extent.
Yeah, he's not unrelated.
But I was there on that stall working away, and people would come past, and we had all the stuff for Finding Folklore laid out, and I would kind of essentially sort of just pitch it a little bit to them and say the first episode is out today or coming out tomorrow or whichever day it was. The first story is Rufus the Red, the Red King of the White Ship. Are you from the... And I'd asked them, are you from the forest? We talked about this at the end of the podcast. You said, go and ask people if they know the story. And I did.
Well, yeah, okay. And what did they say?
You were absolutely right.
Yeah, I know. That's brilliant. I'm really glad.
Every single person... In fact, I did ask them if they could remember where they first heard it sometimes as well. And they could not.
Brilliant.
Yeah, they were never taught it. They don't remember... They don't even specifically remember who would have told them it is a story. They just know the story. Everyone knows. And then uniformly, anyone who was not from the forest didn't know it. Didn't know who William Rufus was.
Isn't that cool?
Fascinating.
Isn't that cool? It's like, I love that.
But more than that, when one person who was definitely from the New Forest immediately referenced Cob and... he said Perkins rather than Purkis.
Oh, that's interesting.
And there was something different about his understanding of how Cob fits into it. But I can't quite remember what that was. Maybe it was something to do with him being. It might have been that Cob had a dream as well or something. Brilliant. I don't know. There may be some other variant there. No, it wasn't that. I would have asked him more about that if he'd said that. But anyway, he definitely Cob and Purkis were the two. Well, I think he probably said Tyrrell as well, but the four names that we had
the four names
in the podcast are the names
that people
from the forest know.
Also, I mean, I would say I am from the forest through and through. My telling of that story is a valid continue. It is the forest version. It's not. This is not an example of an outside writer or storyteller coming and imposing or twisting or altering anything on the local tradition. I am a part of that local tradition inherently, by definition.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm really happy that you asked.
No, I did. I properly asked them and completely validated exactly what you said was the case. So I'd like to go into a bit more of the stuff that connects to local area.
Just
stuff.
local folk stuff. Yeah, we touched. So obviously,
we did mention a couple of things. Did we mention the dogs?
No, I don't.
Ghost dogs. So
I think we mentioned
there's a lot of
them.
Ghosts sort of associated with this story that come after the fact.
Loads actually, and that's one of the things that people. That's one of the things people say. In fact, I vaguely remember mentioning it to someone at the show, and they talked about how the ghost of Tyrrell goes up and down the lane near their house.
It's great.
Even though he died in Jerusalem and fled to Normandy, never came back.
As you say, never came back.
His ghost still is seen regularly. Yeah, there's actually loads.
And also, the thing is, Tyrrell's dog.
Tyrrell's
dog is like a fairly significant ghost.
A black dog.
But he's like, what really is Tyrrell's dog's place in the story? Nothing hinged on Tyrrell's dog.
Tyrrell's dog is irrelevant to the story.
He was a faithful hound who was abandoned.
I've done tellings of it in the past where I really amp up the role of the dog. And I make.
See, that would make it make sense.
I give his dog throughout, and then it's this great betrayal that Tyrrell abandons his dog, and when they can't find Tyrrell, they kill the dog or something.
Oh, see that warrants a ghost.
But that is not.
Yeah.
So far as I know, that is not.
That's
part
embellishment
of the
on your part.
That's my embellishment.
Great.
Which is valid because I'm of the forest, but it is my embellishment. I'm not inheriting that authorless folk version of that narrative. which is why it's not in the book or in this thing. That's just something I'll throw out sometimes at events. The genesis of we'll start with Tyrrels Dog or Tyrrels Hound.
Yeah, Tyrrels Hound.
And going into all these. So this is the hardcore. This is the real folk stuff.
Yeah.
The two earliest folk elements are Purkis and Cob. Now, as we've established, they could be folk developments of early or like that second wave of historic textual accounts.
Yeah.
But as that second wave, what enriches them, by the second wave, I'm talking about Guymar's account and or Derek's account. The thing that gives those any advantage beyond just rehashing the earlier textual accounts, the first wave, is that they seem to have these eyewitness accounts. They've interviewed and spoken to people on the ground there.
Yeah.
I believe that's the main difference. Again, that's a theory, but it's a theory that's very much backed up by the primary evidence.
Okay.
So what that means is that whilst they could have taken it from that, I think it's also plausible that those second wave accounts simply took it from that oral tradition, that memory.
Yeah.
So we've got Purkis, but so whether or not those names were original or they came later is irrelevant. Purkis and Cob as characters are the two earliest folk interpolations, over and beyond and separate to the literary or textual or historical tradition.
Yeah.
It's impossible to say at what point those are established in the folk. Sometime later, we have, I think off the top of my head, there are two key animal spirits here. Yeah. There's Tyrrels Dog or Tyrrels Hound, and there's
the stag.
The stag, the Red King's stag or the Red Stag. Now, so Tyrrels Hound is first. I can't remember which. Actually, if anybody is interested in this, obviously you should be buying this very good book. New Forest Myths and Folklore.
To your camera.
To my camera. New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice, Stratford, published by the History Press. Regularly goes out of print, so buy while you can. It's also regularly discounted. The only reason I'm looking through this now is because I want to tell you exactly what the source, the earliest source for the folk.
For the sightings of the red stag.
Yeah, here we are. Red King and the White Ship. Yeah, exactly that. Here we go. Okay, so this account was sent to the June 1938 edition of the Folklore Journal by one Grace Partridge Smith. I've slightly edited it. I've removed some of the extraneous sentences, but it reads as follows. The following brief but suggestive anecdote was related to me by a friend born in Lymington in the New Forest. The story recounts one of her mother's experiences while a child, which she in turn passed on to her family. The incident, involving 4 generations, reflects several age-old superstitions. My friend told the story in her mother's own words as follows. After supper, we children gathered around the hearth fire. One night, grandmother was telling us that we must be good, and that if we were not, Tyrrels Dog would get us. At that moment, there dashed into the room from the outside door a huge black dog. He rushed past us in frantic haste and disappeared where there was no outlet. Okay, now that Grace goes on to inform us that the woman who told her the story had no notion of who Tyrrell was or might have been, or what the origins of the dog were. Though this is perhaps due to the fact that she moved to America soon after, where she then spent the next 50 years of her life. That means the woman who sends this in must have been in her 60s at least, and she's telling the tale in 1938. If the story is told in the words of her mother recounting her own childhood, then we could date this account of the dog running in, Tyrrels Dog will get us, to the mid-late 1800s. So that's quite interesting. I don't know whether that was prevalent folklore in 1938, but certainly throughout my childhood, it has been prevalent folklore. This is the funny thing with... This is the weird nature of folkloristics and the study of this stuff, is that by observing it, of course, you distort it. It's impossible for us to know whether this was just a thing that one old lady did and was into, in the mid 1800s, and then almost a century later, it gets published in that journal.
And suddenly it becomes widespread. It gets
disseminated, and people start finding out that it's folklore, so then people start believing it.
Oh, cool, that's a great story. I'm going to scare my kids with
exactly.
Tyrrels Dog.
It's impossible to say whether that's how it happened, or whether it was widespread then and then was consistently widespread through to the modern day. It's impossible to say that. To some degree, it doesn't matter, because that's the nature of folk. Yeah. That's the nature of folklore, folk culture. But the fact is that, so far as I'm aware, for as long as I've been around, this has been a thing, relatively widespread, this talk of Tyrrels Dog. Yeah. And it certainly was a thing in the mid to late 1800s, rather. Whether there was a gap, I don't know, and how long prior to the mid 1800s it might have existed as folklore. Yeah. I don't know, I can't say. But it's interesting, obviously, because it connects with a lot of other black dog folklore.
Yeah, so you were saying that you're kind of making this category of black dog folklore, the spirit hounds that roam the moors or whatever.
Roam the moors. Not usually moors so much, but yeah.
Where do they roam?
Well, they roam all sorts. Often they're associated with hills. And in fact, they're often called grims or grim. The obvious examples are, I think, Black Shuck is one of the classic ones. There's a lot of different black dog apparitions in English folklore across the country. And the New Forest actually has another pair in
one of which is grim.
One of which is called Grim. The other of which is called Holdfast. Yeah. And those are connected to a different story, to the story of the Biston Dragon. We won't go into that now because that's episode 7, I think. Yeah, we're doing that.
That'll be fun. We'll go into that when we get to it.
That'll be really good fun. But for now, we stick with this.
But just quickly, as a sort of side note, that sort of that spirit hound kind of ghost dog mythology or folklore, like that's what Hound of the Baskervilles was sort of tapping into.
Absolutely. Yeah, he was sort of that wasn't coming from nowhere. Yeah. That is a long and well established thing. Yeah. Is the black dog. Mark Norman is the folklorist. He is the host and creator of another very good folklore podcast called The Folklore Podcast. I recommend it. Go and enjoy it. It's very different to ours. It's a fine partner piece. He's written extensively on black dog folklore in Britain. Hey. I recommend his works on the subject. The interesting thing is this association with grim. They often appear alongside a hill or burial mound or earthwork of some sort. Yes. Yeah. Often that's called Grim's Ditch or Grim's Pound. In fact, there is an earthwork in the New Forest called Grim's Ditch, which is related to the black dogs of the Biston Dragon fame, Grim and Holdfast. Yeah. That's interesting because there's a theory that Grim there's loads of areas in the UK, earthworks, places and so on, called Grim, or some derivation of Grim. In the Norse context, Grimnir is an epithet, an alternative name for Odin, or Woden, as it would be in the English context. So there is a theory that Grim was also a name for Odin that was known in England, for Woden that was known in England.
So is that an alternative name or a sort of like a descriptive?
Oh, it's it's the line between these things is
of course.
So alternative names for Odin were also, I think, something like the Scarer
which is a description.
Which is a description. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, so we're saying potentially that Grim being associated with Woden being associated with a burial.
Yeah. It's impossible to untie that knot.
Yeah, exactly. What does that mean?
Who knows? Who knows what that weird mat of folkloric hair could possibly mean?
But then possibly
these weird connections might exist.
Yeah,
might exist, especially when you look at this. So this is not something I necessarily subscribe to, but it's really interesting to be aware of. There's this whole Sacral King thing with Rufus. One of the key elements of Woden or Odin or Uthen is this nature of him as the hanged god who sacrificed himself to himself. He's a sacral king, right? Now, Lammastide, being the time that this all happens in, was through the very much discredited Margaret Murray witch cult hypothesis that was popular in the sort of mid 20th century, and akin to the Golden Bough of Fraser. All those ideas and theories, which were very quickly discredited in the scientific community, but which really, really held on for a long time in sort of
caught people's imaginations.
Yeah, caught people's imaginations. They persisted in the mainstream, and they were really entrenched in the arts and creative spheres. In those sort of realms, connect Lammas to this idea of the sacral king, whereby the king, a la the Fisher King of Arthurian myth and legend, is an embodiment or avatar of his land. And so when the land is ill, so too the king is ill, and vice versa, which doesn't bode well for us at the moment. But there's this idea that by ritually sacrificing the king, and a new king then being reborn, so you can kind of revive the crops, revive the land.
Yeah.
And this is something, this is connected again to like the Wicker Man stories, and to lots of other things.
It seems like a fairly sort of essential redemption myth. Like it's the Christian myth,
yes, very much so.
A king who is sacrificed for the good of the people, the land.
Well, that's interesting. This line between land and people.
Well, you see that I think that gets particularly complex when it comes to Christianity. But anyway, let's maybe not deal with that right now. Not solve all the world's problems.
I'm not sure we're solving any of the world's problems. I'm not sure this counts as one of the world's problems.
Well, yeah.
I mean, maybe this is the problem. Maybe we need to sacrifice a king.
Yeah. But regardless, Sacral King.
We're no dissent here. No, we're not.
Let's not.
Whoa.
But short of sacrificing a king, this idea of the Sacral King, you think can be connected with Rufus?
There was an explicit. So this isn't my theory. That part of the Margaret Murray thing was this theory, this idea that one of these ancient witch cults, these pre-Christian cults that had survived, had explicitly captured and sacrificed William Rufus as part of a great ritual, and that was, I mean, they didn't do a very good job if it was supposed to do anything good for the land, because there was a long. Yes,
but regardless, I think that in the structure of the story, it's very interesting, because you've got what is essentially history, becoming chronicle history, but in its transformation into chronicle history, involving potentially like a little hint, a little kind of influx of this story of a sacral king, being structured so that it fits this idea of a king being sacrificed to heal the land. Yeah.
Well, and interestingly, there's clearly that feel of it there. What I don't like is taking. I enjoy the kind of the glimmer of that. This like germ of it. I don't like it when it then gets.
When it's someone tries to nail it down and say it is this.
This is that. Yeah, I don't like that.
Yeah, that is frustrating.
I also don't think it's about the land. It's about the forest. It's about the new forest. It isn't about the whole nation. I don't think it belongs to the nation. I think it belongs to the Uton, to the Ettinwood. Why did I get onto that? Why was I saying that was relevant to what we were talking about?
Because of Black Dog. Because then you also have the Black Dog associated.
Interesting. Then, so moving on then to the Red King's Stag. Now this one is slightly more interesting. I think we can take the that 1938 account of Tyrrel's Hound or Tyrrel's Dog. Tyrrel's Dog, she called it, although it would have been a hound if he was hunting with it. So that account of Tyrrel's Dog we can take as genuine. There's It's a perfectly respected journal. It wasn't.
And as we say with the experiences of ghost sightings, it is experiential. It's
not an epistemological proposition.
Yeah.
No.
All we can say is that that person claimed that happened.
And also, what's interesting to me is not so much that this claim that a dog did come in. It's more that there was this belief that
the belief existed.
I've been reading a bizarre book lately, which I got stuck in Oxford because I was in Oxford and my phone essentially exploded, just completely died, and so I had to get back. And obviously there was no way of me then showing a ticket to or even getting to the railway station. I managed it, but at the railway station there was a one of those book swap shelves which had like 3 or 4 books on it, and I was bored, so I took one which was called Invisikids.
Oh, great!
And it's about, I forget the name of the chap who wrote it, so apologies to the chap who wrote it. Look for Invisikids, one word, you'll find it. And it is about imaginary friends, but it takes the view. He's a well-respected Fortean writer, I believe this chap is. It looks self-published, but it actually isn't. Again, I can't remember the name of the publisher, but they do Fortean books of paranormal investigation. It takes the tack that imaginary friends are not imaginary, that they're actually some sort of other being who reveal themselves to children. And he uses lots of personal accounts from people that he's accrued over the years to come up with his theories. He calls them QCCs, Quasi-Corporeal Companions, and he divides them into 4 types with 2 subtypes for type 4.
Is this fiction?
No. He's writing this.
This is a non-fiction book.
This is a non-fiction book.
Okay, great.
This is a non-fiction book. It's called Invisikids, which sounds like it should be.
It sounds like
a fun adventure. No. This is real. This is real. And he. So by his terminology, this and I'm not saying I'm sold.
Yeah.
But by his terminology, this is a weird.
Not
route.
Saying you're not.
This is a really weird route to go down.
Okay,
I kind of am saying I'm not. This is by his terminology though. This black dog vision would be, I think, a type 3 QCC.
Okay.
Which is which you can put alongside the wonderful Jeff, or maybe Geff, the talking mongoose from the 1930s.
Okay.
On one of the Channel Islands.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, no. Well, we'll save that for Google Jeff the talking mongoose. I don't actually know. It's spelled Gef. It might be pronounced Geff. Might be pronounced Jeff.
It's one of the.
Jeff sounds better to me.
Yeah.
This might be a type 3 QCC.
What can you tell me what that is?
Well, yeah, type 1 QCC is your classic child, an imaginary friend. The children see another child there.
Oh, okay.
And then I can't quite remember what the type 2 is. The type 2 is different somehow. They're not children. I think they're adults, maybe. They don't play in quite the same way. They're generally a bit more sort of morose, a bit on the back foot, less involved, less active. But did you ever have a childhood friend?
No, I didn't. Childhood friend? Yes.
Childhood friend? Nah.
No, never.
No, I didn't have an imaginary friend.
So type 2 is more...
See, I didn't know, reading this book, this is a total sidebar, by the way, but reading this book, I didn't realize that people with imaginary friends literally see their friends. Like, they literally see them and actually play with them.
I was not aware of that.
And even weirder, like, when they get their parents to, like, lay them a plate of food at the table, they see them actually eating the food. And in their experience of it, their world, their view, they see the food get eaten and disappear.
True?
Well,
according to this book.
Oh, no, it's not just according to this book. This is according to certain personal accounts. This is the memory that those children, those adults now have of being a child. They all say, "Oh, of course, that must have been my head," because obviously it couldn't have eaten that. And the parents also don't see. The parents just see the real world. But which is really interesting. Now, not always. Type 2s, you don't usually see that. I can't quite remember the specifics, but then type 3 is an animal.
Drop-dead Fred, is he a type 2?
He is a type 1, I think. Oh, no, he's an adult, though. He's an adult, I guess Actually, no. Type. I think Drop Dead Fred might be a type 4. Yeah, we'll get that.
Mystical creature.
Type 3 is an animal, generally. Then type
Harvey.
4 is weird. Harvey, Harvey. Type 4 is really weird. Actually, again, Harvey might be type 4. Type 4 goes into 2 subtypes. Yeah. There's the sage. The sage is usually in human form. They're always an adult, usually older. And they usually, you only see them from the waist up. Usually half of them is like buried in the floor somehow. And they dispense wisdom and advice. They're often eccentrically dressed. And they might seem like they're from another culture. But they usually have, their first name usually is like Steve, even if they're, I don't know, a Hindu wise man or something.
Cool.
And then there's type 4B, which is, I can't remember what they're called, but they're something like weirdos or crazies. And they're bizarre things. Actually, hang on. I think then type 4 subsection Bs are like inanimate objects which grow legs and arms, essentially. Like the radiator just grows legs and arms, or a poker grows legs and arms and starts moving around and talking. This is something that children apparently see quite regularly. And I think, according to this book, something like 30% of children have at some point imaginary friends, or QCCs.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And it seems to me that I don't think that them actually existing and coming from some other plane of existence, which is one of the theories proposed, I don't think that seems to be plausible. But I think it's more than plausible that children would just, certainly while they're developing, it would be to have to hallucinate.
The mind is a powerful thing.
To just be, while they're still developing, to exploring things and learning from them. Interestingly, a lot of the type 2s especially, like, tell them to do better, or like tell them, don't do that, that's dangerous. They sort of tell them how to operate and do things. I can't quite remember the specifics of the type 2. So buy it.
Which is quite interesting, because that is very interesting, is the sort of the categorization of these things into and a sort of a bit of actual research into how often people see what they see.
Research.
But the idea of that, the idea of a bit of research into that seems, for some of these, cause there's some Disney film or something coming out, has come out recently about invisible friends. And
has it?
Yeah, I can't remember it. I didn't look into it too deeply, but I don't feel like that. I feel like it's more about putting big fun characters on the screen
than actually
rather than.
It made me want to rewatch Drop Dead Fred. Which is, for anyone who doesn't know, I think it's a classic. I can't remember it very well. Rick Mayall plays an imaginary friend in it.
A lot of people love that film.
Yeah,
I think it's potentially quite disturbing on a rewatch.
I remember that we had it on a VHS tape that we taped off something, and I think my dad had recorded over the end. So we got to the end, and then it was something else. And so my mum tried to save it by we all had to come up with a different ending for the.
Oh, that's very sweet. Sweet. I've made myself want to rewatch Harvey.
That's great. Harvey's brilliant. Harvey's very good.
I think I've only ever seen it once.
Everyone should rewatch Harvey. You'd be good in a stage version of Harvey.
Thank you very much.
Anyway,
I'd like to get back to this.
I think
Stag.
a QCC type 3 is what Tyrrels Dog could have been, if not a black dog. But we're moving on now to the red stag thing. Now, the red stag is
potentially couldn't be anything like that, because this is an ominous animal.
Yeah, and also so as I was saying before, we did the massive weird sidebar on QCCs.
This is the sort of thing you're getting in for if you watch our videos.
What you can expect is recommendations of that ilk in VisiKids. Whilst I'm very confident in saying that 1938 account of a mid-late 19th century belief is kosher, is above board, is correct, the origin of the red stag one is slightly vaguer. So the tradition is first recorded by Ruth Tongue in her Forgotten Folktales of the English Counties of 1970. Now, Ruth Tongue is a bit infamous in folkloristic circles because she wrote many, many, many books, but she also made a lot of stuff up. Yeah, people reckon. Now, she didn't make everything up.
Was discovered to have definitely made some stuff up.
Yeah,
not everything.
Not everything, but some stuff. So it's difficult to. You can't take something that's from her without
fact checking it.
Wondering. Now this one kind of. I don't know why she would have. I mean, to be honest, I haven't done this legwork yet, but it could be done because she gives a number of details here, which could be delved into in the records. I will read this. So this is. Some people have mistakenly thought. Some writers have recounted this and thought that it was Ruth Tongue telling this. This is in Ruth Tongue's voice, but it's not. Okay. Ruth Tongue is simply replicating what she claims the original teller told her. Uh-huh. So this is not in Ruth Tongue's voice. She was not from the New Forest. This is from whoever told this to her. When my granny was little, we lost her 3 years ago, she had an old great uncle who'd been a New Forest verger all his life. He lived to be over 90 and remembered the press gangs and riding officers and Waterloo, and he always said that when the reigning sovereign was going to die, a huge red deer stag haunted the big tree which some people call the King's Tree. And say, Will Rufus was killed there because the arrow was deflected on it. I read that very badly. Sorry, everyone. William Rufus was called the Red King, and so Granny's great uncle called the ghost deer the Red King's deer, and said you could tell by the size of its slots. That's the name we give to the hoofprints of a deer. Could tell by the size of its slots how heavy it was and how fast it was going. If it stood a little while, then the death wouldn't come for nearly a year. But if it galloped, the death would be in just a few weeks. The account goes on to describe that only 4 or 5 keepers had actually seen it through the centuries, and all of them had described it as a big red deer stag, not a fallow buck. And all who witnessed it died violent deaths, it seems. The slots apparently were seen in 1820 when the mad old king died, which coincidentally that was the last time dillegrout was consumed at the following coronation.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's fun. Maybe that's it. It all makes sense.
It all comes together.
As well as at the deaths of the following, as well as at the deaths of the following 2 monarchs in 1830 and 1836. The teller goes on to report that her father, as a child, claimed, "I went when Teddy was ill. That's Edward VII, and I was still a boy. The slots were there, and again for King George V. A huge, heavy red deer stag, got all his rights, I should judge." And there aren't any his breed or size in the forest to my knowledge, even since the park deer got out after the war. The teller describes seeing the slots herself near Christmas 1951 and returning home to hear on the radio that King George VI was ill, later dying on February the 6th. So the details that could be fact-checked there are finding a verderer who lived to be over 90 would be relatively easy to do. As it is, all this must be...
And also fairly rare.
Yeah, this is a 20th century New Forest verderer who lived to be over 90. On the other hand, let's see, he remembered the riding officers on Waterloo, so he must have been born at some point then in the... When was Waterloo?
Don't ask me.
Well, he lived to be... so I guess... When was Talavera? Waterloo's after Talavera. Literally, I'm just going on sharp, but regardless. So he, so mid 19th century he was around, which means that he must have died in the early 20th century, in his 90s. We could look into that. Maybe I will prove or disprove this claim.
So what else did I notice in that? The mention of the King's Tree. Like, is the King's Tree a thing, or is that
the King's Tree? Well, I would imagine that
that's the one which was where the Rufus Stone now is.
Yeah, so there's a tree. You don't get this superstition spoken of much, but there is a tree near the Rufus Stone that's said to be a descendant of the tree that the arrow glanced off of, which is we should already talk about what the Rufus Stone is. It's a good cyber. So the Rufus Stone. So we're going to go full circle now. This is, I'm comfortable with big, weird meanderings.
I think that's fine.
Cool. So we going back to the various accounts of the thing. Interestingly, the earliest account places this is happening near Brockenhurst. The earliest accounts that refer to the first wave of accounts refer to it as being near Brockenhurst. Now that's interesting because that's been completely ignored and forgotten since then. Nowadays, people talk about there only being two likely locations, one of which is at what is now called the Rufus Stone, which is near Minstead. And that's become a very popular tourist landmark. I won't quite say destination, I think it's over-egging it, but it's very popular. And this is where I can't remember which monarch, actually I can tell you, it's in this very well-written book, New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice Stratford. I highly recommend you get a copy. Yeah, so after the Restoration, Charles II was supposedly shown the oak tree in Canston Glen, which is near Minstead, which the arrow glanced off of to kill him, to kill Rufus. After some time, it was so interesting. It was said to leaf anew on Christmas Day. There are various...
Which trees don't usually do.
Trees don't usually do that, but there's a few trees in the New Forest that have that bit of folklore associated with them and have done for some years. I think the wonderful oak of Cadnam was very popular. I think I found Elizabethan references to it. I think it was called the Hampshire. But there was also the groaning tree, which we'll go into some other time. Yeah. That was called the Hampshire Wonder rather than the wonderful oak. Different things. But yeah, a lot of New Forest trees supposedly have this ability to either flower or leaf anew on Christmas Day magically, akin to the famous Glastonbury thorn, which supposedly comes from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea, and which I think was vandalized a few years ago. Actually, I have this vague idea that it was. But in the 18th century, this tree was felled for whatever reason. And in 1745, then, a monument was erected by Lord Delaware in the place where that tree had stood. So that means that from Charles II's time, so it's the 1660s, we have this tradition that was the site where it happened, in Canston Glen near Minstead, the site now of the Rufus Stone. That stone, the stone that was put there as a memorial, it was sort of three-sided and had a ball on top and had engravings telling the story on all around it. Over the years, that became such a popular site of pilgrimage almost that tourists, souvenir hunters, would hack off chunks of it.
A little piece of it, yeah.
Like with the Berlin Wall or something. To the extent that in the 19th century, I believe, it was encased in metal. Which is the current state that you can find it in. It's encased in metal, and the three metal sides have. No one actually knows whether it's a different inscription to what was originally on the stone underneath, or which might still be findable on the stone underneath. I would love to have that removed and see what's there. We can put it back on afterwards. I'd love to
just make sure
see what's there.
That'd compare the two.
Get a 3D scan of it and then put it back. That'd be cool. But it has. Around the three sides, it says the story of where this is from, and it tells it's the story of the killing of Rufus. It also name checks Purkis, which is nice.
Oh, really?
As such, ever since then, it's had this great significance. There is also another tree nearby, which is probably what she's referring to as the King's Tree, which supposedly is a descendant of that magical oak that was felled, which the tree glanced off. And this descendant also has this reputation of leafing anew on Christmas Day. But nobody knows whether nobody can quite decide or agree on whether it leaves anew on New Christmas Day or Old Christmas Day. So that's the thing. So, if you go on Christmas Day and you see it and it hasn't done it, it's because you're on the wrong day. That references the change from the Gregorian to the Julian. Sorry, the Julian to the Gregorian calendar meant that in 1750 something. I can't remember when. You remember when? It's 1750 something. I feel like 1752, but maybe that might not be right. It's
Don't ask me.
Mid 1700s anyway. The calendars were changed, and as part of that, that's when we got leap years. And as Britain was actually very, very late in doing that. Most of the rest of the world's already done it. So we were quite late on that. We lost what amounts now to, I think, 11 days. I think it's 11 days. So there's, after that, all folk traditions, whether they're hauntings or magical oaks, bifurcate so that you are unsure whether they should be observed on the old date or the new date.
which are 11 days apart.
Which are 11 days apart, which is quite fun. And so you end up with all sorts of cool things, which actually we'll talk more about this when we come to episode 5 and we start talking about Halloween, I think. That'll be there's quite a lot more to say on this.
We're starting to get to Halloween.
Yeah, we'll save that though. We'll save that. So there's that. So that's the main one. So Minstead is obviously, or Canston Glen, the Rufus Stone, is the main site that's spoken of. There's another site which a number of people say, oh well, that isn't even really where it happened, Minstead. It actually happened in Bewley, which is another village, at a place called Thruham. They say this is definitely the real place, and there's a much smaller stone there. This is, if you're interested, I highly recommend going to visit Bewley. Bewley Palace House is a lovely stately home. It's also owned by Lord Montague. And you will also find the National Motor Museum there. And in the grounds, alongside a very beautiful walk alongside the Bewley River, which is the only privately owned riverbed in the country. All the rest belong to the Crown. This one belongs to Lord Montague, yeah.
Cool.
So cool.
Yeah, cool.
Whoa! There's a little stone to say this. Yeah. Actually, it happened at this place called Thruham, which we reckon was in the Bewley Estate, this area. A lot of people who love to sort of debunk things and say, well, actually, it wasn't the Rufus Stone, it was at this place. But again, that's completely ignoring. I think this conclusion was come to by a historian who may or may not have been called Arthur Lloyd, a local historian. I can't quite remember. A little name will flash at the top if it wasn't Arthur Lloyd. But I feel like Arthur Lloyd is also an actor. So maybe it wasn't Arthur Lloyd. Don't know. It's written down somewhere. This idea of it being Thruham. The first person to mention it being at Thruham was, I think it's Leyland, writing in the 1500s. So writing centuries, like 500 years after it happened.
After the events, yeah.
Which is crazy. And it's only 100 years later that the King Charles II is shown it as being at this place there. So 500 years later or 600 years later, and one is the local tradition, and the other is what someone who has absolutely no connection to the area and no inside knowledge of the area says, and he doesn't give any sources for it. Yeah. So there's absolutely no reason to prefer, there's no legitimate reason to prefer that this random 16th century reference to Thruham as having any greater weight. Even if Thruham was in the Bewley estate, there's no reason that particular document has great validity. And I think what weirdly no one talks about is the fact that the earliest accounts that referred to a place, which were actually at the time referred to it being near Brockenhurst.
Yeah, Canston Glen is just down the road from us.
Yeah, it is. But then so is, in fact, in the other direction, so is the Rufus Stone. So yeah, the Rufus Stone is closer to Canston Glen. The Rufus Stone is closer to Brockenhurst than it is to Bewley, or than Bewley is to Brockenhurst, or Thruham is to Brockenhurst. So I think that I'm also I don't really much like the Bewley theory, just because I think it's built on really shaky ground, and I think people generally, the people who have latched onto it,
embraced in order to correct people.
Because they like to say, actually you're wrong. It's actually this. Technically, you'll find this, and I don't think that it is. I think
it's funny because I think there is a real tendency to embrace an alternative theory just for the sake of having something to
hold over people.
Correct people.
People love it. People love correcting people. So that's how does okay. Let's try
these were just a few of the things that I was picking out of the story of the stag. The King's Tree was how we came to that.
That's right. The King's Tree. So the King's Tree is probably, because of when that would have been happening, which is the 19th or 20th century. The King's Tree would be referring to this oak that supposedly is a descendant of the original tree, and which then relieves. I mean, even though it's an oak, so.
And what did you say that the stag was seen by the King's Tree?
By the King's Tree, which makes sense if that's where it happened.
And it's just that anyone who saw the stag itself
dies a violent death.
Whoa.
But so
I want the details of that.
Yeah,
she just glosses over that.
But she also mentions that.
She mentions that from the slots you can tell both how large the stag is.
I mean, that's standard for slots. You can from slots you can tell.
So that's
not magical.
That's just an explanation of how slots work.
How slots work. That's just
how
understanding
big it is and how fast it's going.
Yeah, and the speed is how deep they are because obviously they're running, and it also.
So what she's suggesting is that by just seeing the slots, you can tell that it is the right one because it's bigger than any stag is supposed to be.
Yeah. Now this is what's interesting. This is actually one of the reasons that I don't think this is just Ruth Tongue making it up. Specifically because Ruth Tongue wasn't from the forest and she had no particular forest knowledge. And it's weird. This goes into it gets quite specific about elements of forestry and of deers in particular, which is interesting, and which again
you're saying that it's a stag, not a buck,
not a red hind, no, not a hind, and talking about the slots in detail, referring to these various things, even talking about the keepers and the vergerers. That's not common knowledge. I mean, that's not to mean that she couldn't have then researched it and found the stuff out, but I don't know why she would have gone to the trouble of researching it just for this fairly small passing reference. It's not a big deal it's made of. Alternatively, she could have just wanted something from the area, and so this is what she confabulated. I don't know. It feels to me like it's got a bit more weight to it. It also, the stuff that the examples of things she definitely made up, they're a bit more fantastical than this, and that they've kind of
doesn't have fingerprints on it.
Yeah, this doesn't really seem to. But just because, even if she didn't make it up, whoever reported it to her could have made it up.
Oh, of course.
Or it could have just been a total nonsense that was honestly and genuinely reported to her. I think it will be good. I am at some point going to do the work and trawl through I'll do genealogical research into all the verderers and see if any from the correct time period lived to be over 90.
Yeah.
And also on that note, she mentions that. Oh, I'm on the dog again. Here we go. She also mentions that. And let's see, where's this thing of the keepers who died violent deaths? Because she mentions a few keepers who died violent deaths, so we could look into how many. Here we go. The account goes on to describe that only 4 or 5 keepers had actually seen it through the centuries, and all had described a big red deer stag, not a fallow buck. And all who witnessed... Oh, I was saying hind, not buck, sorry.
I was saying buck.
It also wasn't a hind. And all who witnessed it died violent deaths. 4 or 5... Well, I mean, there will definitely have been 4 or 5 who died violent deaths at some point.
Yeah.
So that's useless. Yeah. But this specific thing of this verderer who lived to be over 90 is worth looking into. I mean, again,
and so the actual sort of the omen that is sort of the core of this is that you see the slots when a monarch is about to die.
You either see the slots. But what's interesting is that the deer actually is there when the monarch. The deer actually does appear as this presaging of the death of the monarch. If you actually see the deer itself, then you will end up dying a violent death. But hopefully you don't. And if you but you can judge just from the slots whether the deer has been there. And so you can then read the slots to discover whether the deer will actually die.
The violent deaths of the keepers should coincide with the deaths of monarchs.
Very good.
If we're accepting without question.
Within a year or two, I would say, yes, certainly. Okay, that's...
I mean, they don't say that. They don't say that they will immediately die.
She said something... That's true.
It could be at some point.
That's true.
Yeah. They just won't die a natural death.
Yeah, that's a good... well done. That's a good route. She says that it's like... It could be a year, it could be a few weeks after the stag's appearance. And with that in mind, it seems like it isn't actually the sighting of the stag that presages the death. It is the appearance of the stag. Whether you see it or not is almost down to whether you're looking. The stag appears in the lead up, I guess, over the year prior to the death of the monarch, and whether or not you see it or see the evidence of it It's down to you.
So, of course, when we're looking at sort of documentary evidence of that sort of thing happening for previous monarchs, it's all quite a long time ago.
Well, actually,
hard to tell whether they are really.
So the reason,
whether it really
it's
did
long ago
precede the deaths.
Prior to Elizabeth, obviously, because she had such a long reign.
But we have an exclusive for you, ladies and gentlemen.
About a week before she died, I did actually receive a letter from someone who claims to have seen the slots.
Yeah.
It was an anonymous letter. Now, obviously, I'd already published the book. It was hand-delivered. It was this shaky... I should have brought it. We'll post a picture.
Yeah, do. That'd be great.
Yeah, I got a...
hand-delivered anonymous
It's
letter.
not the only one. I do talks on this subject within the New Forest quite regularly, and I'm always very vehemently asking people to let me know stuff, to give me any stories or accounts, and it's not hard to find where everyone knows where I live. So I actually I get letters and things not irregularly, and this in particular was one. It was just my name was written on the envelope. It was quite a shaky hand, so it could have been an old person, or just someone trying to disguise it, or someone with a tremulous hand. It was a tremulous hand. And it was very brief. It just said that they've seen the red deer slots, and that soon the Queen would die. Now I can't remember whether a week before she died.
Sick by then?
Well, there was a photo. There was a photo that was released, and she had I seem to remember one of her hands in the photo was really grey, and someone said that that's a symptom of some heart problem, and it means she's near death. I vaguely recall that being a thing.
That seems.
But it was maybe.
That seems tenuous.
Yeah,
I'll take the stag.
So that happened. Someone put that through. I don't know who it was.
It's great. It's like an M.R. James story.
It could equally have just been a hoax, a funny jape, or someone wanting to keep the story alive and reckoning that the Queen was going to die soon.
I mean,
so doing that.
If it was, they did a great job. Yeah. They nailed it.
I guess we'll just have to keep. We just have to keep abreast of this the situation as it develops.
Dear viewers, if you see the slots of the red stag, please do let us know.
Let Charles know.
Yes.
Charles is ill.
I mean, I'm not sure you.
I hope that he
should let Charles know.
Oh,
I'm not sure I'd want to know if I was.
Yeah, but you're not the King of England.
But if I was. Imagine I'm the King of England.
Let the palace know. Don't tell Charles. But tell the palace.
They can't do anything about it.
The machinery of state.
Again, it's like an M.R. James story.
Warning. They probably already know.
Yeah.
They probably got drones over the tree.
Forest.
Yeah, just
and then
watching.
And then a poor drone operator who's going to die a violent death.
Oh God, yeah. Or it might be that the drone itself just explodes in the sky. The drone is one seen it, and he's just seen footage of it. So that's the Red King's. That's the Red King's deer.
Yeah.
Right. That's another one of them. Now, and as I say, it being Ruth Tongue, you've got to question how true or genuine or authentic. Perhaps authentic's the right word. This was when she wrote of it. However, it is certainly believed in now. It's caught on. So even if it wasn't believed in then, it is believed in now.
A lot of this sort of folklore that might have spurious sort of origins.
To what extent does it matter?
I mean. There are several that I could mention, but I'm not sure. It might annoy people if I suggest things aren't.
Yeah. Best not to go down that rabbit hole. But I'll tell you,
they are popular now. Happy. I think that
make
people happy.
The proof in the pudding there is whether they are still popular in another couple of centuries. When something has lasted, once it's been organic and unselfconsciously part of something for a few centuries, I think so long as it's being powered by the folk, by the people on the ground, rather than by guidebooks or the media or fiction or something.
Yeah, I mean, to follow this.
As long as it's got to be folkloric.
Yeah,
and obviously those definitions are vague and splashy.
Of course
they are. That's the nature of the beast.
But to follow the idea of rewilding, it's like having planted a plant and if it takes root or not.
So what other? So there's this thing. So I mentioned in the story some of the this idea of Ocknell Pond.
Yes, the pond where Tyrrell washes his hands.
Where Tyrrell washes the blood from his hands, and now every year on the anniversary it runs red. Whether that's old style or new style date, who knows? I can't say. But
you have to go both.
We have to go both. We have to go both. Always go both.
Yeah.
Always go both. We send the drones out twice. So that runs red. Now there's obviously there's a number of it's very commonplace, this idea of a stream or a river or a body of water going red, and that's often explained as being chalybeate, which is when copper oxide, so iron oxide in the waters or from various algae in there turns it an orange or ruddy color, which could look like blood. I don't think that's always necessary, but also that can make for very healthy water, or water which is drunk for healing properties. So that combines with all this folkloric stuff. That could be what's to do there. That's interestingly, that coincides with one of the supposed omens of the death of Rufus, which again was recorded in the early wave, of the first 30, 40 years after it happened, of accounts that a river or stream ran red, or that just blood bubbled up from the ground. Either there are two accounts of this. One says that it was in a place called Finchamstead for 3 weeks. Another one says that it was for 15 days at a place at Berkhamsted, I think. If in doubt, check the book, read the book, or Google it. Like, look, do your own research. It's also actually in Frank Barlow's very good biography. He covers a lot of these, and he does it in a very good way, much better than I think a lot of the other biographies. In that he tries to cut right through to the bare bones of events, and then he starts layering on the accounts, all the accounts about stuff after the fact, rather than melding them all together, which is what most do.
There's a lot, though. There's a lot.
There's loads. There's
like also, you're saying this about the dreams, the multiple dreams that people had. There's
loads of different versions
in the
dreams.
Story in the podcast, you included 3.
I include the 3 most well-known and standardized dreams, and partly because, and that wasn't even really that much of an authorial thing on my part. In fact, it wasn't curatorial or authorial, because those are the dreams that people in the forest know. But like those are the ones. When people tell the story, those are the dreams that people tell. So those are the ones that are stuck, and also that all 3 of them are part of the older, the first wave of accounts. There's other things that I didn't include, like, for example, I forget which who was doing this sermon, but there was a sermon in France, I think, the night before, where he called upon God to strike William Rufus down. He described this sermon was sort of about, I think, the sins of Rufus and all that, the hedonistic lifestyle he was living, and his court were all living. Awful people. It was described as saying, not to worry, because God's vengeance or something is
and he mentions the arrow.
He described his arrow will soon be launched. But he also says that there will be time for him to repent, and there was no such time for Rufus. So I think that doesn't really, even if that were true, that doesn't sound to me particularly. That one, though, is generally used as evidence that there was a conspiracy by the church to kill him, rather than it was magical. And even it sounds at best coincidental. But I also don't know how that seems like a fairly standard metaphor to be using.
Especially if you're spreading the net as wide as some part of France.
What some others? So an interesting one is a dream which I alluded to in the story, but I actually stopped before we got to the meat of it, because it essentially replicates. I thought it would give the game away too much. There's a version of the second monk's dream, the one from an abbot, I think, in Gloucester, usually. And again, the places where the monks who dreamed, or the abbot whose abbey it was, these change and vary, different places. I won't go into the. That's boring. We won't go into that, unlike the rest of this stuff. But in that version, you're up looking at Christ on his throne, and essentially the devil, this great black horned beast, comes up to him and presents these arrows, and Christ says something like that one will kill the king or some such.
So really spoilers.
Yeah, essentially, it's an alternate version of the part of the Cob story.
Yeah.
So it takes Cob's bit essentially.
Yeah.
And I don't think you could have had
both of them in.
You couldn't have had both of them in. It's a
melding. It's probably a way of making the story work.
And in the story, you have Cob arrives at the same time as the report of this what that dream would be.
So they're very close together.
So it seems to be them like being melded into a single bit.
Yeah.
Where so you remove Cob, but you kind of include that as part of the dream that the rider then tells. And obviously we're keeping Cob, and also I'm just going with the story as it's told here. But I threw in that black figure because too good to not have, and also it's good to reference that he does appear in a dream as well. He was also seen throughout the forests in the lead up to this happening. There were accounts of the devil stalking the land and explicitly starting up conversations with people. And some accounts with Normans in particular, not Anglo-Saxons, not the English. And in other accounts, specifically talking to them about the king and Ranulph Flambard and other people who supposedly were there. It's an interesting element of this.
Who the devil? The devil himself.
Just starting a chat, right? God, what do you got? The bloody king there? That guy, I tell you, he's he'll get his. Yes, sir. Interestingly, one of the weird things about this is how none of the accounts really say who was there, and that's quite odd because it's kind of they are actively not saying who was there rather than just they're not saying it was there. It's quite weird that they didn't say who was there. We know that Walter Tyrrell was there, obviously, and Rufus. We also know that Rufus's brother was there.
Yep.
And we know that someone called William of Breteuil or Bretel, or do you know how to pronounce that? It's a French place.
No, I don't know.
Brit. I don't know. Ends with an L. There might be one more person who they agree was there.
Yeah, but then they omit.
They omit all the others, and there's lots of different theories. I mean, I list a few of them in here. Ranulph Flambard is one of them who was potentially there. He goes on, I think, to be a prior at Christ Church, which is nearby, and that relates to another story which isn't in this series but is in this book, which happens I think the following year, 13 years later, which is the Christ Church dragon, when a 5-headed dragon flies across the sea and then destroys Christchurch, lays waste to it. Great story, incredibly obscure in this country, better known in France. Weirdly, so there's him. There's also a crazy figure called Gerard, who I think he went on to become Archbishop of York, and I think was previously equivalent in Hereford. This guy was unpopular at the time, and there are stories of how he worshipped the devil, and the devil told him to take a pig and to do weird to sacrifice the pig to the devil, and then he took the pig and tried to get everyone to eat sweetmeats and hors d'oeuvres made from this pig's devil flesh. But fortunately, the cook I think was aware and buried the real pig and used a fake pig, but the devil found out, and there was hell to pay.
A fake pig,
or
just a replacement,
a non-cursed pig. He also supposedly got pregnant by a man, and then died from the devil child he was carrying.
Oh man!
Yeah, literally, a man.
Yeah.
There's some wild stories about this Gerard guy. So he was very plausibly on the hunt too. There are some others. There's one in particular which is nice because they're descended from the Lascelles family. He was plausibly there, and in fact, and I've included this in the book. There's a tiny fragment of family mythology within the Lascelles family. Famously, Tommy Lascelles, who worked very closely with Queen Elizabeth, was a descendant of this family. There's supposedly when he had to leave because of some sort of bad news, so the king gave him some kind of token, and that token then so because of that he wasn't there for the hunt. He left that morning, and that token, the image of it, then became part of his his coat of arms.
Oh wow!
And a blazon, I think. Yeah. Again, that's probably not historically factual, but it's a nice story to include. I really like finding these tiny little, very niche elements of stories like this. So that's a small familiar one that really was just carried on down within their family. But it's nice to see when a larger story gets a sort of sub-folkloric afterlife, a sub-afterlife. And then it's nice to see whether that can then be brought together.
If you can incorporate
Obviously, I didn't mention it in the oral storytelling version, which
that is in the book.
But it is in the book. Yeah, it is in the book.
I remember that one from the book.
Myths and folklore of the New Forest.
But so the horned figure, I don't think we talked much about him in the podcast. But
there is actually one more example of this horned figure. So I've mentioned the dream, and I've mentioned the appearance of the horned figure, who could be thought of as the devil, but not necessarily. Appearing in the woods, talking to the Normans about Ranulph Flambard and the king. Also, after the death itself, the Earl of Cornwall supposedly witnesses a great black goat. With the blackened corpse of the king chained to its back. And then he talked to this goat, and the goat tells him that this is the corpse of William Rufus being dragged to hell for punishment. And that's one account. Other accounts
this goat man seems to be awfully chatty.
Yeah, I know. He's
still have conversations with people in passing.
A friendly guy.
Wait, so who was that? Who witnessed him?
The Earl of Cornwall, I think.
The Earl of Cornwall.
The Earl of Cornwall, I believe, was the one who witnessed that. Now, what's interesting about that is this. You kind of actually throughout, you see this figure appear in a number of New Forest folk tales.
Before we move off that,
you've been trying to get me to talk about for ages.
But just occurred to me. The Earl of Cornwall would presumably have been a Norman as well.
Presumably, yeah. Interestingly, nice. Yeah, presumably. Well, I'm not sure who the Earl of Cornwall was at that point.
But anyway, so this figure, this
probably find
horned.
So this horned figure appears. You get weirdly this horned. He's usually got a big bushy moustache, hairy somehow, and ram's horns. They are specifically ram's horns.
Yeah.
And in many accounts,
curved horns.
Yeah, and very often
and being referred to as a goat.
Yeah,
of course,
being referred to as a goat. And in some versions, it is a man goat or a half man, half goat. It's black hairy thing.
Which is, I feel like that's not. Certainly not a modern way of how you describe the devil.
No, you would, and I think the devil does have cloven hooves, so this idea of this goat element could be there. But really, it's more akin to Pan or something. Now, what's really interesting is that alongside this figure appearing, and obviously this story, he appears in a few others, some of which we'll talk about later in the season or other. So I won't go too much into those other examples. But what's really cool is that in the 1960s, near a place called Boulder, which is near Lymington, in a disused gravel pit, there was a little boy on holiday here was playing, and he found this weird carved stone, and he put it in a little trolley, and he wheeled it to the place where we were staying, the little cottage, and then for the next 10 or 20 years, it was just a garden ornament that stood on a post next to the gate, until it came to the attention of academics in the late 70s, I think, or the 70s, who identified it as being a sub-Roman or pre-Roman Celtic godhead. Now, Celtic is a broad, almost useless umbrella term in this context, but the tribe, it was the Belgi or Belgi were the tribe in the area. And there is one theory is that it was near the boundary between the I think the Atrebates or the next. I think it was the Atrebates, the Belgi, and the Durotrides. I think it was like that. I might be mixing my Durotrides and my Atrebates up, but
that's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah, that is how it goes. I think the Durotrides was down there. I'd also that may well not be the correct pronunciation of either of those, but actually, having looked at all the boundary maps I can find, they're not actually. It isn't actually that close to the boundary. It doesn't seem. So I'm not sure how. Yeah, well, that's what they say.
So to explain a little bit, like one of the first sort of field trips that you and I went on was a trip to the Hampshire Cultural Trust.
Yes, that's right.
To go and see.
So actually, look at this stone head. It's not on display. It's not in a museum. It's held by the Hampshire Cultural Trust.
Yeah, in a warehouse.
In a warehouse. Well, it's
in a box,
barely a warehouse.
In a box in a warehouse.
The corrugated iron shed. Yeah. It's like as I say to everyone, it's like a really low budget version of the end of Indiana Jones. It was just this bizarre little shed, essentially, filled with cardboard boxes, and within one of these cardboard boxes was this, I don't know, 1600, 2,000-year-old Godhead.
Yeah,
it was pretty battered. It was heavy. I don't see how a little boy could have carried. It was heavy.
Picking that up, like we were. They were very nice to let us.
Very nice.
Very welcoming at Hampshire Cultural Trust.
Highly recommend.
Thank you if you're watching.
Yeah, I don't. Some of those elements of the story don't really hold up, and also it's weird that they didn't. That there's no further details. They didn't want any more details.
Yeah. Well, but so the thing about the head is that it does seem like I've looked at a lot of pictures of Romano-British stone heads.
There's nothing like any.
And it seems quite different from them. There are things that you can imagine might be similar, but also the thing that strikes me as it might be interesting as a border marker is the triangular shape of it. It has two distinct faces.
Yeah, I mean it's the same face, but there's two distinct faces in the sense of two distinct sides.
Planes, two different planes.
A single face and two.
Whereas a lot of the other...
They're front on.
Yeah, they're flat. Very flat. The eyes are on a single plane. Which
also,
is...
There is a theory that the Belgi were a Germanic people themselves who'd come over a little earlier. So it's possible that there's a subtly different culture from the surrounding Brythonic cults. Which might account for some differences that we should probably compare with continental Belgic stone carvings. But yes, that's interesting. This fellow is a.
So I'm not sure if you mentioned he has horns, of course.
Oh, yes, he has.
That stone head is horns.
Yeah. The stone head has an upward turning bushy moustache.
It's very clear on the thing itself. Yeah.
And unambiguous, unquestionably, it has these curving ram's horns.
Yeah, not quite as prominent as those ones. They're done more as a sort of frieze around the ear.
Which other thing is, but you can find pictures.
Well, we may even be able to post possibly actually, even a 3D. I can link you to the 3D render that they allowed me to do a 3D capture of the stone head, so we have that now online.
Weirdly, So enjoy that. Also, it's weird that this hasn't ever really been engaged with or picked up on by. It's really cool, really
because that's really old. That's
really
sort of 3rd century AD.
It's mad to just touch it and hold it and be in this weird cardboard box in a shed that no one cares about. Really, it's really cool. So what's interesting about that is there's these weird parallels between this specifically ram-horned figure, hairy figure, and then this figure, this stone head, which has what looks like a big bushy beard, very prominent upward curling moustache, bulging eyes, and these ram's horns specifically. Now there are some. I think Belatu Kadros, is a horned god that you can find traces of up north around Hadrian's Wall, and I think there might be 1 or 2 depictions of him with ram's horns. Usually he has different horns, but that's way up north. There's nothing like that down here. There's nothing like that in the vicinity. It's really distinctive and stands out.
I suppose we should mention this guy. Because he's got horns.
He's got bull's horns. That's the Dorset Ossa. But really, I think he's got to do with it.
Different era.
We could. I suppose we could.
There's all sorts of horned
figures.
But yes, I think it's tempting to sort of run away with it, but it's not. There's not necessarily.
I don't think we need to. Well, this is the case. So this is jumping back to the witch cult stuff. I don't like this weird. This means this. Here's the theory. This is about the Sacral King. I like just noting these weird parallels and the weird, the knottiness of this clump of hair. These things are connected. But we don't know what that means. I like that. It's way more interesting just to see that there is this, with nothing else, there is this it's almost semiotic or aesthetic maintenance. This symbolism recurs. I think that's interesting. And it doesn't have to be anything more than just something interesting which you pick up on, which you emphasize, which you return. And I suppose we'll do that. So one of the projects we were doing at the New Forest show was this New Forest Ooser thing. Yeah. We were there with the New Forest Heritage Centre, which is a lovely little local museum in Lyndhurst, which is soon to celebrate an anniversary, I believe. I think it's almost 50. It's been around almost 50 years. I think it's 45. I don't know.
Don't ask me dates.
Yeah, we'll find out. Google it. There you go. But so we were there at the Heritage Centre's tent in the New Forest, at the heart of the forest area. And we had this idea of trying to bring this currently very obscure archaeological find back into like the folk consciousness, the local cultural consciousness.
Yeah, so this is the Boulder Head, which seems like a really...
Boulder God-head.
It's an really exceptional object.
Yeah, it's an exceptional object. And it's obviously something that you thought people would want to engage with, but no one's aware of it. So we had this idea of engaging with beginning a sort of reconstruction process of it, but going through the lens of the Dorset Ooser.
Which is a folk mask, which is quite popular among, mummers and Morris dancers.
Anyone engaged really in British folk culture is aware. Oh, and the very famous Reader's Digest myths and legends of Britain has a picture of the Dorset Ooser on the front cover.
Now, so the original Dorset Ooser is lost. Does not exist anymore. It was privately owned and presumably crumbled to dust.
It came to people's attention in the 19th century, is when it came to attention. And it was at the end of around 1897 was the last time it was heard of.
Just at the advent of photography. So there are two existing photographs.
It looks like this, really.
Pretty close. He has a bit of hair.
This
is an early draft version in resin.
If you Google it, you will find that it's spelt Ooser, which the instinct is to call that an ooser, but we have it on good authority that it was pronounced locally as Ooser, right? Now, what is not always emphasized in this is that you can very clearly see it with this mask version because the original was much bigger than this and made of wood, but you can see this jaw is hinged, as was the original, and that connects distinctly with obios or hobby horse traditions that we see across English folk performances of this same era, whereby there would be usually it was the Padstow obios is one of the most well-known examples. But there's loads and loads and loads of others across the country. There's actually a really good little zine that I got recently, which I can't remember the name of, but we're going to, up there, somewhere on this screen, it'll be saying what this zine is. And I encourage you to go and support a local artist and buy a copy of this. It's really great, beautifully done, really well done.
But that's connected with the stuff like the Mary Lloyd, isn't it? The snapping
it is.
Head on a stake.
Well, the Mary Lloyd is one of many examples. It's one of the most, because it exists in parts of Wales, the Mary Lloyd, people seem to really love clinging onto it, but almost exactly the same thing as elsewhere.
Old hob,
old warb. There's loads of other examples. It's very big in Cheshire as part of the souling plays that happen around Halloween, All Souls now. Kent has its own hoodening traditions, Padstow, as I mentioned. This exists across Britain, all across it. There's loads of examples of this. As I say, read this, get this little cool zine. It's brilliant. It's very good. Covers it very well. And the key to these is that they're usually used to chase and play around with people, snapping jaws. Sometimes they'll steal things. They're very sort of impish figures.
Yeah, and we know that the Dorset Ooser was used in that kind of festival context as well. And since it clearly, from the pictures, has an articulated jaw, it's got to be.
And it's called an Ooser.
Yeah.
So it seems like the connection is
all do seem to converge.
Got to be that. And I don't think that clear connection is emphasized enough in discussions of it. that's kind of a clear thing for us. So what Jimmy, we won't go into too much details, but Jimmy is trained in traditional hand making of leather masks for the commedia dell'arte, hardened leather. He'll carve wooden matrices and he'll then...
And I shape the leather over the top. Yeah. It's
good stuff.
It's good fun.
It's good fun. Well, I'm sure we'll do it at some other...
Yeah, we'll look at it at some point.
In due course. He also has started exploring... That's obviously very expensive, very time consuming, and he's started exploring making molds and using resin to create similar ones. So that's what this is. This is a resin mask for... Jimmy is planning on developing both wearable light versions of this Ossa mask, where the articulated jaw can be used and operated by the mouth, which will be purchasable. But he's also planning on making full-size replicas.
Would be very nice to make a full-size Dorset Ossa, which has the articulated jaw.
There are a couple.
It would be great if I could make one out of wood as well. Like,
I mean, the ones that exist. There's a couple of those. There's one in the Dorset Museum, and they're perfectly good. But there's something about the original photo
he's got
which
such a mysterious expression.
The original.
Yeah, the original has such an ambivalent
really
look. Yeah, I always describe it as I'm not sure whether if I'm afraid of him or he's afraid of me. There's a real fear in his eye, I think. But it's very difficult to capture.
When you put those teeth in, it really changed the whole thing. That the teeth are a big part of it. So what we're doing is we're reconstructing the Boulder Godhead through the lens of the Dorset Ossa to create the New Forest Ossa. The idea being that it's a wearable mask version of the Boulder Godhead that can be used explicitly as part of folk performance and folk festivities, such as at the Green Man May Day parade that started last year.
Which should be a lot of fun for that sort of thing.
Which is of actively misrepresentative historicity, but I won't get into that. Or the New Forest Mummers, who are on much firmer ground. The original Dorset Ossa has bull's horns and hair around it, so the New Forest Ossa obviously will have ram's horns and wool around it.
Yeah, it'd be nice to try him with a bit more hair going on.
This is obviously just a maquette. This is
a maquette. In fact, this is a hand puppet.
Jimmy's also into Punch and Judy. That's another thing Jimmy's into.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So, but to take it back to our horned figure in the in the forest.
Yeah, well, this is a good example of our attempts to rewild stuff to kind of organically allow this aesthetic, which is clearly a recurrent aesthetic for whatever reason, but without kind of imposing a rigid or authoritarian interpretation of what that means onto it, simply allowing that aesthetic to be maintained, to continue the existence of that aesthetic in a much more fluid and less controlling way, which I think that kind of looser grip allows it to remain and root as folk culture.
Yeah, because I don't think we're trying to say with the New Forest Ossa, I don't feel like we're trying to kind of say that is a thing, or
we're definitely not. Yeah. I mean, I'm not.
But it is just interesting to take an image which is nearly 2,000 years old and sort of put it through a lens which is 200 years old and
then kind of allow it to just unselfconsciously be a part of the current. It's cool. This is and it is vague and mellifluous. These are not. It's practical. It's experiential. All this stuff is. And it's interestingly, I don't know if you can see it, but the figure, I had nothing to do with this either. The illustrator, Catherine Souter, entirely off her own back, read an early draft version of the manuscript and chose to use this ram-horned figure as a cover illustration. And I think does a very good job of it too.
Yeah.
So
with the Stratford lion in the background, no less.
And this Stratford lion. Maybe we'll do another. Maybe next season we'll do the Stratford lion.
We should do the Stratford lion.
This ram-horned figure, he does appear in other elements of New Forest folklore. So that's another good example of this retention. In fact, the devil does appear in the forest, and in New Forest Romany Gypsy, or New Forest Romany or New Forest Gypsy, they themselves have different preferences, and I do not seek to impose a preference upon them, as they are a true forest community, and have a solid claim to the forest, more so than many. They have a lot of their superstitions, a lot of their folklore, which again, this is in the book, really explicitly talks about the devil as walking the forest, the devil as stalking the forest, or the mullah, as he's called, or the beng is the proper Romany term for the devil, but the mullah.
I love the mullah.
Is a parochial term. Great name. And interestingly, mullah, it means to kill or to beat up. And that's used as a metaphor in standard British slang now. To if you get mullered, then that's getting really drunk.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would also use it for, or at least fight. I did use it in the 90s for if somebody got like really taken out in sport or something. Oh, he got mullered.
Yeah, it's fun. A large amount, a surprising amount of British slang is Romany, and people are not aware of that. Won't go too into that because we will probably do an episode where we go deep into that side of things. But there's also in the New Forest there are these patches of woodland called hells, which are where everything closes in, it starts to seem strange, you become discombobulated. Those are all connected potentially to this side of things. Then we come to the actual ghosts proper, and there's loads of those. So William Rufus himself is seen in ghost form. Every year I hear of some new sighting. Sometimes he is seen travelling the path that he was dragged up to Winchester Cathedral.
Where the unnatural flowers dwell.
Yeah, so this tradition of him being dragged on a cart and bleeding all the way, and scarlet pimpernel flowers growing along there. It's really interesting.
The bleeding corpse is such a... it's such a great image. I mean, a lot of this stuff... So, sorry, this is a slight tangent, but When Rufus's brother goes to the little cottage and meets this weird woman, weird with a Y, it all gets a bit Scottish play.
Yeah, it does.
Like you say, shall be king hereafter, which is like instantly reminiscent. But then you've got the washing of the hands turning the whole
that's interesting.
Red.
You do. That's interesting.
The corpse bleeding. The corpses are meant to bleed when the murderer is present.
Yes, they are. That's cool. Especially as these elements are all they all predate Shakespeare by at least 400 years, which is fun.
Are there any other elements in there that remind me?
Think about that. That's interesting. And it is the death of a king. It's the obvious thing. A new person becoming king. It's not quite as disastrous, actually. It's the anarchy comes after he dies rather than while he's around. That's interesting. That's something to think about. That is interesting.
If there's any connection with Shakespeare, it's got to be extremely light and tenuous, I think.
Only to the degree that everything's connected to Shakespeare.
Everyone's referencing Shakespeare all the time.
But also, I would say you've got to remember as well, Shakespeare was referencing. I mean, I don't think he would have been particularly. He would have known about William Rufus. I don't think he would have been actively referencing.
No, I don't think he was going for it.
But the stories, by the time Shakespeare's coming to his sources, this is all, this predates those, and it's all part of the same.
We'll be coming back to Shakespeare next week.
James, is literal culture. That's just the development of culture. You're just talking about culture.
And the thing is that Shakespeare is so omnipresent. Amazingly so.
And you're right, we will be coming back to Shakespeare next year.
Next episode. Next episode we'll be talking about.
So we'll leave off on him.
Shakespeare chat.
We get Puck next.
Oh,
Puck will come up.
Spoilers.
Sorry, I think it's a teaser. It's a teaser. Teasers. Yeah, it's definitely not a spoiler.
Okay,
it's a teaser.
It's true.
It's not. Nothing is spoiled by acknowledging that Puck is in the next episode. Fairies is the next episode.
It's a good one.
Again, a teaser, not a spoiler. So there's obviously William Rufus. He's seen sometimes following that trail of blood, which blossoms into scarlet pimpernels. Interesting about that element is that again, this is all about Lammas. As we mentioned, Lammas is traditionally this first day of harvest, and is connected with traditions around blessing the crops and the fertility of the fields. Historically, often the first loaf of bread would be baked from the beginnings of the crop, and that bread would then be taken to the church and blessed somehow. So the loaf would have a mass. Loaf mass becomes lammas. There's also lots of other examples of corn dollies being made, and perhaps some kind of procession around the area, or a beating of the bands, that kind of thing, which we won't go into too much detail now because there's loads of those.
Yeah.
That's very complex. But what is interesting is that Scarlet Pimpernel was well known amongst farmers for being an indicator that it was a good time to harvest.
Right.
When the moisture levels reach a certain point, the Scarlet Pimpernel opens up.
So they are native to England and to the New Forest, are they?
Yeah.
That's interesting, though. That really ties it to the time of year.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. And specifically, this idea of that is interesting. Again, it's this clump of, I don't know why I've started using this clump of matted hair analogy. I've never used that before, but it's really ugly too. But I'm going to stick with it. This vile comparison. This clump of matted hair, the matted hair of folk, the unwashed folk hair. This again, all these other, there's weird connections which we can acknowledge and recognize and marvel at without having to define rigidly or specifically. It's interesting that all that relates somehow. Sometimes he is seen walking along there. Sometimes sometimes still he is seen on the back of this, or being dragged by this ram-horned man. I have heard someone who's not very reliable say that there's some evidence of that instead of a black goat or black goat man, it's a black dog, but I'm not, which could connect it to the Tyrrels Dog. But as I say, the one person I've heard that from, that's not a reliable source, and I would need to have that
backed up. Yeah. You want a second opinion.
I've also never heard anyone local talk about that. Yeah. So I'm not willing to allow for that just yet.
The image though of the body or the ghost of Rufus strapped to the back of this
chain. And also specifically his body is blackened, either probably from the flames maybe, or just from rotting. Who knows? But that's an interesting one. Is that he's sometimes seen at Winchester Cathedral. He's sometimes seen just like wandering around the area of the Rufus Stone. I don't know if anyone's seen him in Bewley. Oh, that's it. That's more proof that it could have been Bewley, because no one's seen the ghost there. There's plenty of ghosts at Bewley that people have seen, but not that one, I don't believe.
That's probably
interesting. There you go. Do with that what you will.
Yeah.
There's also the ghost of Tyrrell, as we mentioned earlier, is seen. Yeah. There's I think near Burley there's a Tyrrell's Lane, which he supposedly rode up. I haven't gone into the specific details, but there's lots of, along the coast, there's lots of places traditionally associated with Tyrrell's journey.
Yeah.
And his ghost is still seen riding along a number of those lanes. Interesting, his ghost is always seen on horseback, usually fleeing, I believe, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's his curse for the killing of a king, to be constantly fleeing and never resting, never reaching safety for all eternity until the crack of doom. Yeah, that's nice.
That's a good ghost.
Yeah, that's a good ghost thing, isn't it? That's good. There's also this tradition that which actually used to be heralded as fact quite a lot in some of the older guidebooks, that Rufus stopped at a ford and had a blacksmith there reverse the hooves.
Tyrrell did.
Tyrrell, so as I say, Rufus, Tyrrell had the shoes of his horse reversed so that he couldn't then be tracked. And this story, which is believed, is that, and in fact, whenever this was shared, it was saying that the blacksmith to this day has to pay a fine to the king. That it's still ongoing. This fine is. That was then kind of disproved in the 20th century.
But it did go on for a long time.
Well, who knows? I don't know. They haven't actually been able to find any trace of it.
That's disappointing.
It was passed on as being a real thing that's actually happening, but then when this writer Again, it's referenced in the book. I actually looked into it in, I think, the mid 20th century, maybe the early 20th century. He couldn't actually find any record of this find. So maybe it did exist, and then who knows? Or maybe it's a weird one to come out of nowhere, but it's a fun little local detail.
Yeah.
There's also this
reversing the hooves is a thing that pops up it comes a lot. It's in the story of Hermes stealing Apollo's cattle, I think.
Right.
As he reverses his shoes or something, or he puts things on the cattle's hooves to make it look like they were going the other way. I think it must pop up a lot in different folklore.
But what's interesting is when, because I wonder when that would have been accrued in that story.
Yeah,
we don't know. And I mean, this is 900 years is quite old. 900 plus years is quite old. Yeah. It's one would be surprised at how often you'll stumble on. It's easy to think, oh well, this is a very common thing, but it's also easy to not notice that something might be the progenitor, and this particular thing might be the progenitor, especially as obviously older stories evolve and accrue newer details. So sometimes an older story doesn't necessarily exist as the origin of an element.
Yeah.
So there's that element. I'm sure there's some other lovely good local. Yes, of course. So the Purkises, for much time, and still do in fact, make great hay, as well they should, of their named role in this story, this tradition. They are a widespread forest family, certainly now, and have been for some centuries.
Leave a comment if you're a Purkis.
Leave a comment if you're a Purkis. And there's a fun, I mentioned it in the podcast, but there's this really fun story I stumbled on, which I actually haven't seen written about outside of the notes and queries, which is this journal. You can find it online actually for free. A lot of these are the old back issues, the archives, the collected volumes. But in the 19th, I talk about this in the book. Buy the book. I did buy the book directly from me or from us. I don't think it's set up yet, but we should have it for sale.
We'll get it set up on the website.
So you can just go to findingfolklore.org and buy the book.
And presumably we'll send you a badge. Along with it.
Buy the book, you'll get a free badge, maybe something else, and I will sign it with whatever inscription you request. There you go. Can't say fairer than that. It will probably be cheaper on Amazon, but it'll be it'll mean a lot more if you buy it directly from us.
Yeah,
and we'll be as nice as we can, and we'll say thank you. There's that. Rather than just,
I think a nice personalised inscription is a lovely thing. It's a nice
thing. I mean, it would still be. It won't be. It'll be the proper RRP. And I'll personalise it, and we'll give you a badge and maybe some other stuff. Yeah. Anything else? Any free merch that happens to be going on at the time. Yeah. There's this cool story that amongst the Purkises, they actually kept the wheels of the cart that they dragged the king to Winchester Cathedral in. That those wheels have been kept. All the way through the centuries until in, I think, the late 18th century, there was an argument. Someone
between
had
a husband and a wife.
And in a rage, she went outside and burned these wheels, either because she wanted to clean the house and she didn't know what they were, or because she was angry with them.
Doing some angry cleaning.
Yeah. And what's really fun is that in Notes and Queries, I started seeing references to this story, people sharing this story they'd heard. And then sometime later, I saw an entry from someone saying, these stories are genuine, and they actually named the people who were involved, and they specify that it was their grandmother, I think, who was responsible for burning the wheels. And again, of course, you can say, oh, they were lying, or oh, it was self-aggrandizing, or whatever. Yeah, maybe they were, but maybe they weren't.
There's a dozen points that could.
The minute you start saying, oh, they were lying, untrue, then you can always say that about everyone. Okay, here's a thought. Saying that we can't trust him because he was probably lying, how is that different to being a flat earther? We can't trust the scientists, they're just lying. It's the same thing. Just randomly saying they're lying based on, without any particular reason to think they're lying. I
feel like this is a can of worms.
No, I think that everyone is a flat earther unless they take everything at face value.
All right.
Yeah, I stand by that. I'm happy with that.
Well...
I've got anything against flat earthers, of course. Nothing against flat earthers.
If you're a flat earther, leave a comment.
Leave a comment. Don't
start an argument in the comments.
I don't need to.
No fights in the comments.
A friend of mine Tim, Tim,
Yep,
was really committed to being a flat Earther for a while. Not because I think he particularly believed that the Earth was flat, and I think this is actually not uncommon, but as a kind of making a point that we take for granted certain orthodoxies and truths without actually having any idea about whether or not it is true. We just take for granted, it's credentialism. We take for granted that they must know what they're talking about, that they tell us this. This is... this isn't a conspiracy theory flat earther
this isn't what
podcast.
This podcast
this isn't a secret bait and such. We're not going down this road.
No.
We say on the tin.
So after 2 hours, we've brought you
suddenly we unveil. Now we've got you. Now you know what we're going to talk about. I think that this is probably a nice point to conclude. I think we've covered a lot of the key elements of this.
Yeah, is there anything else in
any
the
key bits,
the folklore that we want to go over? We talked about the music on the podcast. We talked about.
I suppose we could talk about the music.
We talked a bit about the process of making the thing, because I think that's part of what's interesting is that we're coming at it from a performance background, and we're keen on the academia and the sort of active enactment of it. So here's one thing. So I drove down to see my parents recently. It takes about 45 minutes, an hour to get there. And as I was getting in the car, I was thinking, do I stick on a podcast? Because I've been almost as research for this, I've been looking at a few different, The Rest is History or Dan Carlin, or do I put on an audiobook? Because at the moment I'm listening to
Return of the Native?
Return of the Native, read by Alan Rickman, which is great. And Thomas Hardy is sort of relevant to all of it, because I was carving folk masks. I wanted something folky, very fitting, something Dorset specific, which Thomas Hardy very much is. And it's an interesting thing, because those podcasts are information. I feel they're if you listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore Histories, you're just getting Dan information mainlined into your brain.
Dan Carlin's entire approach is that we take them at face value. We don't decide randomly that the historical sources are just lying. We take them at face value, because the fact is, even if they are lying, we have absolutely once you start arbitrarily deciding someone is or isn't lying, you're just picking and choosing. So you have to, and obviously I'm not saying this is the only way of doing things, but to actively not do this is stupid. Someone should be looking at it like this. We've gotten so used, weirdly, this goes back to this,
at least for the sake of argument,
this goes back to this weird thing of people like to say, actually Bewley's the real place where this happened. People like to just I feel like there's a whole generation of historians and academics who just, and I think it's partly...
They want to read counter.
Yeah. It's just, I think it's partly a flaw in the way that a lot of universities sort of train people to get marks is, take a commonly held view and then take
subvert it.
Subvert it, invert it, flip it on its head, take the alternative view, disprove it, which is all well and good when you're just training, but when that becomes the approach people take intuitively...
Or to do it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, I don't think that's helping you.
It doesn't... It feels unscientific.
It's obviously useful to challenge theories.
You've got to challenge things, but
what happens is when the orthodoxy becomes to challenge the orthodoxy, it means that
what's the orthodoxy?
When everything is fringe, there is no centre anymore, and that's what's happened.
Comes up in a lot of contexts, including theatre, of course, which is our
you get a lot
chip on our shoulder.
I mean, this is why Bede's account or Beda. His account of Anglo-Saxon history was for many years taken at face value, and then over the last century or so, it's become very fashionable to dismiss it all out of hand. So he was lying about everything, all nonsense. But
people say the same about Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Yeah, well, I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth.
No one ever believed him.
You're really muddying the water there, Jimmy.
Oh, sorry.
Geoffrey of Monmouth is a totally different thing, Geoffrey of Monmouth is a very different thing to Bede.
Okay.
So Geoffrey Monmouth is chronicle history, whereas Bede was not writing chronicle history. Bede is
purporting to be history.
And In fact, part of the problem is people treating Bede like he's
as if it is
Monmouth. Yeah,
chronicle history,
and it's not.
So maybe I didn't muddy the water so much.
Yeah, sure.
I made a useful point.
Yeah, no, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And the reason I mention it is because even though for the bulk of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, it was just commonly done to just dismiss Bede's account of things, the latest genetic studies have actually upheld,
kind of corroborated.
They've corroborated what Bede had.
Are you talking about the stuff in Winchester Cathedral, the bones?
Oh, no, that was part of it. But actually, I'm talking about. Let me try. I think this is a 2022 study from the Wellcome Institute or the Wellcome Trust, which looks at the genetic origins of the population of Britain, and it essentially upholds Bede's account of a lot of elements of history which previously were not
fits with what Bede was saying.
Fits with what Bede was saying, and it actively goes against a lot of
people
preferred modern academic theories. Which is no need to go into the details of that side of thing. That's a whole other video. But that's more than one video. But we're seeing a lot of that. A lot of the favoured academic theories, which were basically just predicated on going contrary to the long-established theories, the more scientific analysis comes in. I mean, and I'm talking about genetics and forensics, such as there's great stuff being done in the field of genetics. It's a really rapidly changing, rapidly developing field to the extent that papers from 10 years ago essentially are irrelevant, and really, if it isn't from within the last 5 years, it's outmoded. So it's a really interesting time, and you're seeing we're lucky in Britain because Britain has the amount of genetic research done on our current population or on the population within the last 20 years is pretty much complete. It's other countries can't really compare to the totality of our testing. But also there's that side, but there's also the testing of ancient DNA is really fascinating and showing really, really interesting stuff with migration patterns across ancient civilizations. But the reason that I emphasize this is because a lot of really mainstream orthodox cherished views from the last 50 years are beginning to be just totally turned on the head, and I mean, I hesitate to say outright disproved, but in some cases outright disproved. And really it's showing that a lot of the last few decades of academic work has been flawed in just prioritizing inversion for the sake
different
of it. For the sake of it, rather than actively trying to... And it's also come from a modern arrogance, assuming olden times people were idiots, which I hate.
And you're saying that Dan Carlin doesn't do that on...
He doesn't do that. Dan Carlin, that's how we got there. So Dan Carlin's whole thing, his like one of his key, one of his precepts is to take the sources at face value.
Just what Pliny said.
Exactly. Oh, he's great. He's great.
Well, just to take a step back from that, back to my dilemma of what to listen to in the car. Right. I was thinking about, the Dan Carlin thing, like that's just information being fired into your brain.
Yeah, but in a really cool voice.
In a cool voice, yeah.
Very cool voice,
sometimes too cool. Whereas listening to Thomas Hardy, I then feel, whether an audiobook is the same as reading a book, but I feel like I've read Hardy. Then, like I know a bit more culture. There's and I don't know. It's just it's a more a work of art than I feel a podcast often is. And I was thinking this about Finding Folklore is that what we're trying to achieve is more. It's not just information that we're trying to convey. It's enactment. It's kind of interaction with a tradition enacted in the podcast through the telling of the story, which I think is I think this is what we're trying to achieve through this storytelling.
Yes, I would say. Yeah, I agree.
It's not just getting information out there.
So far as I'm concerned, this podcast is not. When this isn't. There are some lovely podcasts like Lawmen or some such where they talk about. They talk. Yeah, they talk about folklore. They talk about stuff. Even though at points we talk about it. As far as I'm concerned, this podcast is intended to be a cultural artifact in its own right. An active part of, an enaction of that folk tradition. Which should be something which influences and engages and represents that folk tradition just as much as anything does. We are not,
and hopefully perpetuates.
Yeah, and hopefully perpetuates and
encourages other people to engage in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. This is because, of course, we are performers, we are artists, as well as historians and enthusiasts and folklorists. And I think that too much stuff is. It cuts off. Often when people are engaging with this stuff, they're doing it really weirdly, self-consciously and intellectually, as if they don't count as part of the folk, as part of the people, as if this is just something that you pluck from any context and then look at an arm's length, as if we are these sort of... I talk about the this weird English exceptionalism where when it comes to folk culture, we have the same approach of someone who thinks that everyone else in the world has an accent except for themselves. And I think that we have too much of an instinct in that direction to think that, as I said in the podcast, to think that folklore and folk culture is something that stopped in the early 20th century.
It was collected and then it was finished.
We can read about it or look at it, but because, I don't know, we're all some sort of horrible suburban middle-class office-dwelling intelligentsia who only engage with the world through blogs and podcasts. That's the only way of doing things. That it isn't
sort of living in the machine stocks.
Exactly that. Yeah. Whereas, I mean, and that the objective that isn't true, and I certainly don't believe in it, but I know it isn't true. It's not an opinion or a belief. That is not the way it is for many people, and that's really what this podcast is in many ways, a way of demonstrating that this stuff doesn't just exist as a concept or an academic curiosity to look at or read about, or for, I don't know, David Mitchell to laugh over in a panel show. This is living.
Steady down. Don't alienate our audience.
Is David Mitchell in our audience?
I'm sure our audience loves David Mitchell.
I'm sure they do. I have nothing particularly against David Mitchell.
Sorry, I've made a big deal of it.
Got nothing against David Mitchell, okay? He's fine.
Sorry, go on. That was my fault.
Okay, someone else. Or Tom Holland or Dominic Sandbrook. Or anyone, really. This is something which really is part of people's lives and they've experienced. As you said right at the top, when you actually did talk to people from the forest, ask whether they know this stuff, and they do. This really is genuine folk culture, and we really do have genuine folk culture across the nation, as every nation does. It's constantly evolving, and I think that too often by focusing on this sort of light comedy BBC panel show style approach, and I'm not
disparaging.
I'm not disparaging it. It's all very enjoyable, but I'm saying it's not the only approach. And it shouldn't be the only approach possible, and that you can engage artistically and creatively and authentically as one of the folk, as a person enacting and living within that tradition, and as a part of the continuity of that tradition, both backwards and forwards, without that being inauthentic, without that being self-conscious or forced or at arm's length or self-critical. I think that's a really important element of this rewilding that we talked about in the podcast. This idea of introducing people to their own stories if they're not familiar with them, and if they are, to actually allow them to really inhabit and enjoy and engage with and in and of those stories. People in the New Forest all know this story, but that certainly doesn't mean they won't be able to enjoy our engaging with this story. It'll be something. If anything, it helps to normalize the engaging with that story, so they can.
Yeah, well, the podcast format actually might be quite useful for that in that particular instance of someone from the forest listening to it, because the podcast really is a different form than live show or written account,
and again, it is
or someone telling you a story.
They're hearing it
at home.
That's something too. That these are words being introduced not through the written text.
Yeah,
that's very positive because, of course, the written text, there's far less to interpret with the written text. They say that reading something is a direct and explicit, complete link between the author and the reader. No one else gets in the way. But when you're hearing something, you're interpreting in so many ways. You're not reading in your own voice, for example. You are hearing it, and so you are interpreting the way that it was said. You're projecting. It's coming through your own lens of symbology and semiotics. Plus, there's everything else that's going on in the moment. There's the context in which you're thinking about it. Listening to either an audiobook or a podcast or a radio show, any audio
you almost
drama.
Certainly will be looking at something else when you're doing that. When you're reading a book, you have to be looking at the book. But there's likely to be some kind of visual input while you're hearing
cooking
something.
or driving or whatever. That's interesting. It becomes inhabited and embodied in a different way.
Which is where listening to the radio becomes a lot like brainwashing. I think people were afraid of that when national radio started being a thing because it goes in when you're not paying attention.
Right.
It's passive consumption.
Well, good thing passive consumption hasn't got any negative consequences. We know that now. Hey.
But the thing of it being a podcast rather than a live oral storytelling, there's something very intimate about podcasts. A lot of people listening on headphones, and even if you're not listening on headphones, like the relationship between you and the microphone.
You're right, there is. And I think, this is interesting. People talk a lot about the nature of performance storytelling and oral storytelling, and we did it on the podcast about how it has to be live and it's responsive and reactive to the audience, and how it is magical because of that. This shared space, and all that is true. And we also talked to the podcast about how we worked to find the particular approach that would work for us. Because obviously we can't just record the audio of storytelling to an audience. That wouldn't be right. Because
I don't remember quite how much detail we went into on the podcast about this.
Okay, well,
we can go over it briefly. We tried a few things.
We tried reading we tried doing an audiobook, essentially reading the story from the book.
And an audiobook would be one thing, but it wasn't what we wanted
in this context.
And then next we tried a sort of improvised version. You talked a little bit about on the podcast about the sort of Meisner technique style approach.
Yeah, and we found that there wasn't an audience there, so there was
just me.
We've also gone like. When I have been doing live performance storytelling, Jimmy has recorded the audio of it.
Yep.
And that's interesting. But again, all of these, it's not right. It's not.
So one thing at the New Forest show, we were talking to a filmmaker, a local guy who works in film, and we were talking about filming versions of plays, and that if you're doing a live show of a Shakespeare play, and an actor has a shoelace untied, doesn't really matter if it's a live show. But if it's on film, people will fixate on that untied shoelace.
When it's...
Or the snot bubble when somebody's crying, I think he said.
Who was that?
But it's the same with any recorded media. As soon as it's recorded that way, and that's the same as in a book.
To be honest, it doesn't even
choose your wording.
It's not even it's not even that people will fixate on it. It's that somebody can fixate on it. It becomes because it stops existing just in
forever.
the memory. The memory is obviously mellifluous, and largely we're talking about with QCCs and how children and adults, the memory they have of seeing their QCC as a child, it's malleable. It shifts. Our experience of the world is subjective. It's not based. It is based on objective reality, but it's not defined by objective reality. When it actually is nailed down,
memories are not reality.
It becomes authorial, and so that's something that's fundamentally different.
But it's the density of rhetorical effects in the script that if you saw it written down, it would be way too much. Like if you were reading it from a book, it would be just purple to the point of nausea.
Yeah.
But when you hear it spoken, performed by John Hurt,
especially by John Hurt. John Hurt's wonderful. And
then you've sort of taken that style into your
well, I don't think it's no. I'm not going to. It's not. No, that's far too. No, that's way too
simple.
Sort of. Yeah, that it's not like that. I didn't do that. Yeah. It's more intuitive. When I grew up watching The Storyteller, and for me, so there were three. I've been storytelling for over 20 years as a storyteller, mainly in schools and folk festivals and things like that. But I grew up watching The Storyteller and loving it. But I also grew up with my granddad telling me stories. He would record myths and legends onto a little audio tape for me, and I'd go to sleep listening to them. And then, maddeningly, I'd then take the same tape back, and he would then tape over them with a new story.
Terrible.
So I've still got one, but I've only got the last one. But it's a lovely last one. So I grew up with that. So I was constantly hearing stories, and those two storytellers deeply sort of informed and formed my conception of storytelling and what storytelling should be. And then we sort of revived, and later, like I was about 10 maybe. I went to see, I must have been 10 years old. I went to see a storyteller called Nick Hennessy, who's still around, very good storyteller, at Moores Valley Country Park, some event that was being done there. And that sort of revived this childish love I'd had.
Two early sources.
And later on, I when I was at drama school, I saw Giles Abbott, the blind storyteller, again, very good. I saw him too. We had a workshop with him, and that again revived it all for me. And it was very soon after that I then started storytelling in and on the road. But it isn't that I sort of consciously, explicitly mimicked that.
Sorry, that wasn't exactly what I meant. I mean more that suiting it to this recorded medium, to the spoken medium. Although, of course, there's no image associated with it, as there is with the Henson storyteller.
Well, I
feel like the density of rhetorical effect is required almost for that oral storytelling. We discovered that, of course, you don't want to go back and check dates and who's this guy again. You're having to refer back to the story is not possible in this audio thing, even if you technically can. But that sort of using a lot of repetition, for instance.
Classic, yeah. I mean, all that's just storytelling. Yeah, that's how storytellers.
Yeah. But I feel like there's a real density to it when it comes to the podcast. It kind of condenses in.
Yeah, so it does. I think the reason it condenses is because, as we've said, you can use that once or twice, and those are the things that are remembered when you're actually doing it in person. All those rhetorical flourishes, people hold on to them as if they're landmarks or buoys in the sea. They get held onto, and there's stuff in between that links you to it. That stuff will often kind of get lost because then the focus has gone to this new rhetorical flourish, even though they are used very, very regularly, kind of archetypally. Yeah. But in the recorded version, obviously, because it's a static text, it's a static recording of it. You can't have any. It's not right to call it filler, because it all is there in the memory. Yeah, everything has to engage with it like that. And I think the reason probably the reason that you're looking at it in the you're finding this deep connection with Jim Henson as the storyteller is because I honestly think that's the only other time there has been a successful translation or development of storytelling into a recorded medium. I'm not exaggerating.
That is essentially what I meant.
I don't think there's any other example, and
I think that's just it's apt for the form.
Recorded versions of people's storytelling do not do it. That's if anything, I think that actively misrepresents the experience of having been there, which is what the storytelling was.
Which I think is this is why it was so nice to do a little development process at the start of this. To have those few sessions where we were like, okay, we didn't get it that time. We'll try something different.
To recognise that. The exploratory process was really, really handy because it's one of those things you can only find it through doing it.
Yeah,
I'm very happy with it in the end. In terms of where we got with this approach. Yeah. I mean, just as this is interesting, who knows whether anyone's going to be interested in all this jibber jabber.
If you're interested, let us know in the comments. And also, if anything about this video has struck you as
good, bad, weird,
good, feel free just to make comments. Tell us if there's things we should change about it.
I've not watched it yet, but I think Jimmy always positions the cameras to favour himself. So I'm pretty sure this camera is slightly over that side. So Jimmy looks much bigger than I do. I'm bigger than Jimmy in real life. So if it doesn't look like that, it's just because of Jimmy.
If we look the same size, then
put it in the comments. Let us know. Yeah. What size are we?
And I suppose that brings us to the end.
What size are we? Yeah, I think that's good. Oh, we could talk about the music a bit more. We've not mentioned the music. We probably should because we didn't really talk about Tim Laycock.
No,
much.
Not
we
so
mentioned
much.
His name.
Yes. So Tim is a storyteller and
actor
and of course musician
of long standing and has been around for yonks.
Yeah, it's great.
Not in an insulting way, in a good way. He's very experienced, very well thought of.
Yeah, it's cool. Like we've sort of mentioned that we've been, that we went to record with him to a few people, and they're like, "Oh, that's impressive. You got Tim Laycock."
He's patron of the
Dorset Rural Music School. Yeah,
Dorset Rural Music School. There'll be a link in the description. Have a look.
Hope so.
He was absolutely. Oh, he was great.
Yeah, it was lovely.
It was such a pleasure getting in touch with him. We got in touch with him cold.
Yeah.
Your mum's suggestion.
Because my parents live down in Dorset, and they've seen him. They have been to see things at the Dorset Rural Music School, and my mum is in a choir there. And they just said, "This guy's brilliant. You should get him." So
they were right.
We sent him an email.
Yeah. We sent an email through as just cold, explaining the project. Yeah. He replied very warmly.
Very friendly.
We spoke to him on the phone. He was really, really supportive of
get what we were doing and be.
Yeah, it was really. He there's the violinist Colin Thompson, who he's worked with extensively. We got him involved as well, and we had a lovely day. At his home in Dorset, a really lovely day, just recording music. Yeah. Beautiful home, yeah. Gorgeous, right on the banks of the River Bride. Is it pronounced Bride or Breed?
I don't know.
I don't know. It's spelt Bride. Part of the Bride Head estate. Bride Head, not Bride's Head. Alas. Bride Head visited is what that day was.
But yeah, we're very glad to be starting with Tim because of the continuity.
Yeah, there's continuity, exactly. So he was he's an accordionist, and he was a musician with
is he more concertina melodian?
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, yes. Yeah. Go ahead
with Taffy Thomas, who's a storyteller, a very well thought of stalwart of the storytelling. I hesitate to call it an industry, the storytelling milieu, and has been around since the sort of the 70s revival of storytelling. Really well thought of. I think he's got an MBE or a CBE or an OBE, or he's got a BE anyway, some sort of BE.
Oh, cool.
Something of the BE.
Right.
And Tim Laycock worked with him for many years. He's got this background as a storyteller in his own right, but also as a major part of just the folk scene moving forward. And to find and explore this sense of continuity, working with people who worked with people who worked with people who worked with people who worked with the original storytellers before it was acknowledged as being something separate, is really important to us, and is supposed to be, when we talk about these podcast episodes being folk artifacts in their own right, that's kind of the point, the idea that they maintain this continuity with that folk tradition, so that anyone engaging with these examples of the folk culture is engaging with that continuity of tradition. That's really key to us.
And of course we can say the same of the theme music.
Yes,
Sue Eaton and Martin Bridle.
Again, wonderful, lovely people,
and have been involved with the folk scene for a very long time.
Martin Bridle was one of the puppeteers on Labyrinth.
Yeah, and I originally got in touch with him because I'm interested in Punch and Judy, and he is actually quite an influential Punch and Judy man. And it turns out he lives in the next village over.
Yeah, literally lives in the next village over.
And I came to know about him because I was volunteering at a sort of tool refurbishment charity thing, which he also volunteers at on a different day.
Great.
Bizarre.
Which is as it should be. See,
this
really is this lovely, the matted air of folk culture. And this weird organic way it all works out. We found Martin and Sue, we found through Sue Eaton and Martin Bridle. Jimmy came across them through these folk paths unintentionally. They're from the next village over. Tim Laycock was a suggestion from Jimmy's mum because she engages in performance herself, and that's it. And then we went down there, and that's just the next county over from here. All of this is so organic and authentic and unself-conscious. And obviously, that's not to say that it's the only way we're doing things. We are also, contacting people through the internet and finding other stuff. But it's really nice to begin the podcast, sort of stake our claim with a good old manual approach, just a real human, social
also that
version.
more modern stuff, or the information age stuff. That I don't think that's going anywhere.
Yes, I would never catch on. And actually, also, I would say it's actually certainly for the sort of thing we're doing, it's much harder to find someone who you're gonna click with, who will get it, because you're much like with dating. It's much easier to find someone that you click with and are attracted to if you meet them in person first.
Look them in the eye.
Yeah, look them in the eye. Smell them. That's what I always do. I smell them first.
Then look them in the eye.
Give them a good smell. Yeah, that's okay. Then you look them in the eye, one eye, then the other eye, and then either you say, "All right, come on," or you
move on to the teeth.
Get out of it. Yeah, the ears, the matted hair, the matted hair. So that's an insight into my life. The music has been great. I'm really happy with the music. We will hopefully. The intention is to do further down the line to do more videos and to do interviews with the musicians.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have a chat with them
as extra content. I'd really like to get that up. You might all hate this video format. You might all think Jimmy's way too big, and that he's unwatchably large. So we might have to just scrap the whole thing. Yeah. But we'll see.
Let us know in the comments if you think I'm unwatchably large.
Okay, so that's good. We did the food at the beginning.
Cool.
We've done the music. We've done the talky talk.
Yep.
We've talked about the storytelling itself as a form.
Yeah.
We finished on that fun little on the bit of poetry. I don't know how much there's to that.
I think we've covered an awful lot in this first video, and I think we should call it a day. We should say, thank you if you've watched the whole thing. Then
well done.
Well, thank you.
You're a real one, as they say.
Yeah, you're probably one of our super users.
A super user. We've been told about super users, you see. And we were told at a folk event.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound very folky, does it? But nevertheless.
Yeah. But anyway, so do come back.
Do you want to go to the pub? Should we go have a drink?
Yeah, we probably should.
Yeah, I feel we've earned a drink now. All right, we're going to go to the pub. Thank you very much. I really hope you both enjoyed the podcast, and I hope that you got something out of this.
Yeah, please
let us know.
As you say, I think we say on YouTube, like, subscribe, hit the bell.
Do we say that?
Hit
the bell.
Press the bell to make sure you're notified of future videos, etc. But do join us next time, where we will be discussing Sprackjack. Spoiler alert. And the fairies.
And the fairies. Sprackjack is episode 2. Sprackjack. It's a good old, proper classic fairy tale. It's another New Forest one, detailed in this wonderful book, New Forest Myths and Folklore by Brice Stratford. It's a much shorter story. but that means you'll get more chat around it. And there's a lot to talk about. It's fun. So essentially, something we've tried to do, certainly with the first few stories, is to present very different types of story, very different. It's not like we're doing different styles so much, but the tone and flavor of the stories is very different. First one,
so kind of lay out the breadth a little bit of what English folklore can be.
Generally speaking, when someone does a collection of folklore, it's very rare they'll just make it English. Often it'll be English, it'll be British usually. So there's a couple of English ones, a couple of Scottish ones, a couple of Welsh ones, etc.
Yeah.
And obviously,
very often English and Irish.
Yeah, very often. Yeah. And that isn't inherently, of course, there's nothing wrong with that at all. But what it does do, I think it misrepresents the flavour of all of those countries' traditions, because it implies that, and it can't help but imply, that the one or two versions from that country are the definitive and archetypal version.
Are representative of the whole.
Of the whole. And they're just not.
Yeah.
Because you very rarely get, and this becomes even more the case when it becomes truly international, and you get stories from France, Russian, and Germany, and Spain, loads
South
of other
America.
Yeah. So just by presenting exclusively English stories, what we hope to do is to show just how the sheer breadth and diversity of the tradition, of the form, and certainly the first 3, and I think the 4, are each a very different sort of story. So let us know if that works, because the next one is very fun and silly. It's a good fun fairy tale, and the third one gets a bit weird and esoteric. We'll save that. Sprackjack first, fairies, Puck, Gran Colin, Tiddy Cole, and all the rest.
Spoilers.
Teasers. Okay,
so thank you, and goodbye.
Good night. Goodbye. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Good night. Good night.
Goodbye.
Good night.